The champagne glass slipped from his fingers as I stepped to the microphone, shattering on marble just like the illusion of his perfect life. "You all know me as Alexander Reed's wife," I announced to the stunned executives. "But tomorrow I'll be signing his promotion papers as chairperson of Westwood's board." 15 years of secrecy ended in 5 seconds, all because he couldn't resist introducing me as his trophy wife to the very CEO who reported to me in secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The ballroom of the Archer Hotel glittered like a constellation brought down to earth. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the ceiling, their light dancing across the faces of San Francisco's corporate elite. Everyone who mattered in the tech world was there, dressed in their finest, celebrating Westwood Innovation's latest executive appointments. At the center of it all stood my husband, Alexander Reed, newly promoted to Chief Marketing Officer, basking in the admiration of his peers. I stood in the corner of the room, a glass of untouched champagne between my fingers, watching him work the crowd. 15 years of marriage had taught me Alexander's mannerisms by heart. The way he leaned slightly forward when listening to someone important, the practiced laugh he reserved for his superiors, the casual hand in his pocket when he felt particularly confident. Tonight, his confidence was at its peak. 5 years of strategic networking and carefully calculated career moves had culminated in this moment. My silk emerald dress caught the light as I moved between clusters of conversations, nodding politely at familiar faces. Most knew me only as Alexander Reed's wife, the beautiful, quiet woman who appeared at company functions with perfect hair and a pleasant smile. Few knew I held an MBA from Stanford and had built and sold 2 tech companies before I turned 30. "Evelyn!" Alexander's voice cut through the ambient chatter, beckoning me to his side. "Come here, darling. The CEO wants to meet you." I made my way across the room, navigating between servers carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of champagne. As I approached, I noticed Alexander standing with Warren Phillips, the public face of Westwood Innovations, a man I'd met many times, though, under very different circumstances. "Warren, this is my wife, Evelyn," Alexander said, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that appeared loving but felt possessive. His grip tightened slightly as he added with a laugh, "My trophy wife." The air around me seemed to crystallize. Trophy wife. The words hung in the space between us, each syllable a tiny dagger. Not partner, not equal, not accomplished entrepreneur. Trophy wife. "Alexander speaks of you often," Warren said, extending his hand, his eyes betraying nothing. "It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman behind the man." "The pleasure is mine," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Warren and I had sat across from each other in boardrooms a dozen times, though Alexander had no idea. My role as the reclusive chairperson of Westwood's board was known to only a select few within the company, my identity protected by careful legal structures and limited physical appearances. I'd kept my professional life separate from my marriage for reasons that now seemed prophetic. Alexander's hand remained at my waist as he continued, "Evelyn's eye for beauty is unparalleled. She redecorated our entire home last year. You should see what she did with the sunroom." The room seemed to tilt slightly as another piece of my reality shifted. 5 years ago, I'd led the acquisition of a struggling AI startup that now formed the backbone of Westwood's most profitable division. Last month, I'd approved the strategic roadmap that would guide the company through the next decade. But according to my husband, my crowning achievement was selecting the right curtains for our sunroom. "Is that so?" Warren's gaze met mine with the barest hint of understanding. "She has quite an eye for potential," Alexander continued, oblivious to the current running between us. "She saw something in me when we met, didn't you, darling? Knew I'd end up somewhere like this." The irony was almost too much to bear. I had seen potential in Alexander when we met. his strategic mind, his drive, his ambition. What I hadn't seen was how that ambition would gradually eclipse his view of me, reducing me to an accessory in his climb to the top. "If you'll excuse me," I said, extracting myself from Alexander's grip. "I need some air." I moved through the crowd toward the terrace doors, my heart pounding against my ribs like a caged bird. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, bringing with it the clarity I desperately needed. San Francisco's skyline stretched before me, a glittering testament to ambition and innovation, the world I'd helped build from the shadows. For 15 years, I'd kept my role at Westwood separate from my marriage. When Alexander joined the company 7 years ago, I'd recused myself from decisions involving his department, watching from a distance as he climbed the corporate ladder on his own merit. I'd taken pride in his accomplishments, knowing they were earned through his own talents rather than my influence. But Trophy Wife changed everything. The glass door slid open behind me, and Warren stepped onto the terrace, 2 fresh glasses of champagne in hand. He offered one to me silently. "I apologize for the charade," he said after a moment. "I didn't expect him to introduce you that way." I accepted the glass, taking a slow sip before responding. "Neither did I." "He doesn't know, does he?" Warren asked, though it wasn't really a question. "About your role at Westwood?" "No," I said, watching the lights of a plane move across the night sky. "When we met, I was between ventures. By the time I joined Westwood's board, he was already working his way up through marketing. It seemed cleaner to keep things separate." Warren nodded, understanding the complexities of power and perception in corporate America. "The board meets tomorrow to formalize the executive appointments. Your vote is the deciding one for Alexander's promotion." The weight of this truth settled over me like a heavy cloak. My husband's career now rested in my hands he believed were only good for holding a champagne glass at his events or rearranging decorative pillows in our home. "What are you going to do?" Warren asked, his voice neutral, professional. I turned to face the ballroom through the glass doors. Alexander stood at the center of an admiring circle, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. His audience laughed on cue, their faces turned toward him like flowers to the sun. He was in his element, confident, charismatic, completely unaware that his world was about to change. "Trophy wife," I whispered, the words bitter on my tongue. In that moment, something shifted within me. Not a breaking, but an awakening. For years, I'd been living a double life, powerful executive by day, supportive wife by night. I'd convinced myself it was for the best, that keeping these worlds separate preserved the integrity of both. But standing on that terrace, watching my husband bask in adoration while dismissing my entire existence, I realized the truth. I hadn't been protecting our marriage. I'd been hiding myself. "I believe," I said finally, turning back to Warren, "that every person should be recognized for exactly who they are." "And who are you, Evelyn?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. I straightened my shoulders, my decision crystallizing with each passing second. "I'm the chairperson of the board. And tomorrow, I think it's time everyone knew it." The champagne in my glass caught the light as I raised it in a silent toast to the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Behind us, the party continued, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring on the quiet terrace. Alexander's laughter drifted through the glass, the sound of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had no idea what was coming. The drive home from the Archer Hotel was silent. Alexander sat behind the wheel of his Audi, one hand loosely gripping the steering wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the temperature. The soft hum of classical music filled the space between us. Bach's Cello Suite No. 1, Alexander's victory soundtrack. He always played it after successful presentations, big client wins, and now, his promotion celebration. "You left early," he said finally as we crossed the Bay Bridge, the city lights reflecting off the water below. Warren was disappointed. He wanted to introduce you to the board members who were there. The irony of his statement nearly made me laugh. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd met every board member years ago, hired most of them myself. I had a headache, I replied, the lie sliding easily from my lips. The champagne, probably. Alexander nodded, accepting this without question. My inner world had never been particularly interesting to him. Well, it was an important night. Phillips practically confirmed the promotion. Just need the board's rubber stamp tomorrow. Is that what the board does? Rubber stamp decisions? I asked, keeping my voice light, curious. He laughed, the sound tinged with condescension. For executive appointments? Pretty much. The chairman might ask a few questions for show, but it's all ceremonial at this point. I turned toward the window, watching the fog roll in across the bay. Tell me about the chairman. Have you ever met them? Nobody meets the chairman, Alexander said, accelerating as we left the bridge. Some reclusive tech founder who values privacy, shows up for quarterly meetings, votes by proxy that die. Rest of the time, very hands-off, which is how I like my bosses. And what if this mysterious chairman doesn't approve your promotion? Alexander glanced at me, amused by what he perceived as my naive question. Evelyn, these things are decided long before they reach the boardroom. Warren wouldn't have announced it tonight if it wasn't already a done deal. I nodded, letting him believe in his certainty. In truth, his promotion had been hotly debated among the board for weeks. Alexander's marketing strategies had delivered results, but his leadership style had raised concerns. 3 executives had left his department in the past year, citing his difficult management approach in their exit interviews. I'd recused myself from the initial discussions, but my vote would indeed be the deciding one tomorrow. Until tonight, I'd planned to vote in his favor. The trophy wife comment had changed everything, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it revealed a fundamental truth about our relationship that I'd been avoiding for years. Alexander didn't see me as an equal. He never had. We pulled into the driveway of our Presidio Heights home, the exterior lights automatically illuminating as the car approached. Alexander killed the engine and turned to me, reaching for my hand. I didn't get to tell you properly. Thank you for being there tonight. You looked stunning. Everyone commented on it. Not on my intelligence, not on my conversation, but on how I looked. The perfect accessory to his success. I expected to feel anger, perhaps resentment, but instead, a strange calm settled over me. For years, I'd maintained the separation between my professional power and my personal life, believing it preserved the authenticity of both worlds. Now I saw it differently. I hadn't been protecting anything except Alexander's ego. I'm happy. For you, I said. And in that moment, I meant it. Alexander had worked hard for this promotion, regardless of how he viewed me. He squeezed my hand before exiting the car, already scrolling through emails on his phone as we walked to the front door. Inside, he headed straight for his home office, calling over his shoulder, I need to prepare a few things for tomorrow's board meeting. Don't wait up. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, slipping out of my heels and unzipping my dress in one practiced motion. The emerald silk pooled at my feet, and I stepped out of it, moving to the bathroom where I methodically removed my makeup. In the mirror, my reflection stared back, a woman at a crossroads. Most people in my position might have stormed into the party and exposed Alexander's condescension in front of everyone. Others might have confronted him during the silent car ride home, demanding an apology, an explanation. Many would have been plotting revenge, preparing to humiliate him tomorrow during the board meeting he had no idea I would be leading. But as I studied my reflection, I realized I wanted none of those things. What I wanted was recognition, not just from Alexander, but from myself. For too long, I'd compartmentalized my identity, keeping my power confined to boardrooms while playing the supportive wife at home. The division had seemed necessary, even noble at the time. Now it felt like a betrayal of my whole self. I pulled my hair back into a simple ponytail, wiping away the last traces of mascara. Without the carefully applied makeup and styled hair, I looked like the woman who ran Westwood's board, focused, clear-eyed, decisive. This was who I had always been, whether in a boardroom or my own home. My phone buzzed with a text from Warren. "Confirmation of your attendance tomorrow? The legal team needs to prepare." Board meetings were typically announced weeks in advance, with the chairperson's physical presence noted in the official documentation. My appearance tomorrow would require special preparation, not just legally, but personally. "I'll be there," I typed back. "In person." "Alexander?" Warren asked, knowing the complexity of the situation. I paused, fingers hovering over the screen. The conventional response would be anger, confrontation, or public humiliation. But I'd never been conventional. "Let the meeting proceed as scheduled," I responded finally. "No advance notice." Warren's reply came seconds later. "Understood." I set the phone down and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. San Francisco glittered in the darkness, buildings standing tall against the night sky. Somewhere in one of those buildings, my boardroom waited, the large chair at the head of the table empty until tomorrow. The sound of Alexander's voice drifted up from his office. He was on a call, probably with his team, strategizing for a meeting he believed was a formality. His confidence had always been his strength, but also his blind spot. He saw what he expected to see, believed what he wanted to believe. For 15 years, he had looked at me and seen a beautiful wife, an elegant hostess, a tasteful decorator. Tomorrow, he would look at me and see the truth. I slipped into comfortable clothes and moved to my own home office down the hall, unlocking the drawer that held the documents I would need for tomorrow's meeting. The board presentation was already prepared, loaded onto my secure server, waiting to be projected onto the screen at Westwood's headquarters. I reviewed the executive appointment documents, Alexander's name prominent among them. My finger traced the line where my signature would go, not as Evelyn Reed, wife of Alexander, but as E.J. Chambers, chairperson of the board. For years, I'd maintained separate identities, separate bank accounts, separate careers, believing it preserved the peace in our marriage. Now I understood it had only preserved the illusion, an illusion Alexander had been all too happy to maintain. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, locking it with deliberate care. Tomorrow would change everything, not because I planned some dramatic revelation or public confrontation, but because I had finally decided to be fully myself, in all contexts, at all times. The unconventional response to disrespect wasn't anger or revenge, it was integrity. When Alexander finally came to bed hours later, I was already asleep, or pretending to be. He slipped beneath the covers, careful not to wake me, and settled into dreams undoubtedly filled with tomorrow's triumph. Little did he know that in just a few hours, we would both be awakening to a very different reality. Morning arrived with San Francisco's characteristic fog, wrapping our home in a soft gray blanket. I woke before Alexander, as I always did, watching the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he slept. In these quiet moments, I could still see traces of the man I'd fallen for 15 years ago, the ambitious startup marketer with bright eyes and boundless energy. We'd met at a tech conference in Austin, both of us speakers on different panels. Mine was about emerging investment opportunities in biotech, his about disruptive marketing strategies for tech startups. We'd exchanged business cards, then drinks, then dinner. By the end of the weekend, we'd mapped out our next 3 meetups across the country, aligning our speaking engagements to intersect in Boston, Chicago, and Seattle. Alexander had been magnetic, intelligent, driven, passionate about his work. He'd listened to my ideas with genuine interest, asked insightful questions about my ventures, celebrated my successes without a trace of insecurity. He'd seen me fully then, recognized my ambition as a mirror of his own. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded to the kitchen to start the coffee. As the machine hummed to life, I reflected on those early years of our relationship. We'd married 2 years after meeting, both of us riding high on successful exits from our respective ventures. I'd sold my biotech analytics platform to a pharmaceutical giant. He'd helped take a social media management tool through a lucrative IPO. We were equals then, financially, professionally, emotionally. The shift had been gradual, almost imperceptible. Alexander joined another startup, then another, climbing the ladder of Silicon Valley success. I took a different path, moving toward board positions and strategic advisorships, preferring to guide companies from above rather than within. When the opportunity came to join Westwood's board, I'd already been serving as an advisor to the company. The previous chairman was retiring, and the board unanimously voted me in as his replacement. My appointment coincided with Alexander's frustration at his current position. Westwood's looking for a marketing director, I'd mentioned one evening, scrolling through my emails at the dinner table. Might be worth exploring. Westwood? He'd looked up from his plate. Aren't they still pretty conservative? Old school tech? They're evolving, I'd said carefully, not mentioning my new role in that evolution. New leadership, new direction. Alexander had applied, interviewed, and been hired all without knowing my connection to the company. I'd recused myself from his hiring process entirely, instructing the board and executive team to maintain my privacy. At the time, it had seemed like the right decision, protecting the integrity of his career path, ensuring his advancement would be based solely on merit. The coffee machine beeped. I poured a cup and moved to the bay window overlooking the garden, watching the fog begin to lift. In the 7 years since Alexander had joined Westwood, he'd risen steadily through the ranks, from marketing director to VP, and now, potentially, to CMO. During those same 7 years, I'd led Westwood's transformation from a traditional hardware company to an integrated technology solutions provider, tripling our market cap and establishing a reputation for innovation. All from behind a veil of privacy that had, until now, seemed necessary. Footsteps on the stairs announced Alexander's approach. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in one of his favorite suits, hair perfectly styled, the very picture of executive confidence. "You're up early," he noted, reaching for the coffee. "Big day," I replied simply. He smiled, interpreting my comment as recognition of his importance. "Should be straightforward. The board meeting's at 10, formal announcement by noon, press release to follow." He checked his watch. "I need to head in early to review things." "With Warren." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "I have some meetings myself. I'll see you there." Alexander paused, mug halfway to his lips. "There? At Westwood?" "I have a lunch near the office," I improvised smoothly. "Thought I might stop by afterward to congratulate you properly once it's official." His face relaxed into a smile. "Perfect. Wear that blue dress. The photographers will probably want some pictures for the company newsletter." He leaned down to kiss my cheek, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering as he moved away. "Dinner reservations at Aquarello tonight, 8 o'clock. After he left, the house settled into silence. I remained by the window, contemplating the path that had led us here. The growing disparity in how we viewed each other had been evident in 100 small moments over the years, but I'd brushed them aside, focusing instead on the comfortable rhythm of our lives. Evelyn has an eye for aesthetics. He'd tell dinner guests while showing off our home renovations, never mentioning that I'd calculated the ROI on every improvement, negotiated with contractors, and managed the project timeline myself. She keeps herself busy with charity work, he'd explain when colleagues asked what I did, reducing my board positions and strategic advisorships to volunteer work. My wife has excellent taste, he'd say when complimented on his wardrobe, never acknowledging that I'd built and sold a fashion tech company before we met. Each small erasure had seemed harmless at the time. Now, strung together, they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. I set down my coffee cup and moved to prepare for the day. In my closet, I bypassed the blue dress Alexander had suggested, reaching, instead, for a tailored charcoal suit I typically reserved for board meetings. The outfit was a statement in itself, professional, authoritative, unmistakably serious. As I fastened a simple strand of pearls around my neck, my phone buzzed with a text from Warren. Conference room A prepared as requested. Legal briefed, security informed. The machinery was in motion. In 3 hours, I would sit at the head of Westwood's boardroom table, not as Evelyn Reed, wife of Alexander, but as E.J. Chambers, chairperson of the board. I studied my reflection. In the mirror, seeing not the carefully curated image of a trophy wife, but the woman who had built companies, guided strategic decisions, and transformed an industry giant, all while maintaining a division between personal and professional that now seemed not just unnecessary but harmful. The weight of 15 years of compromise settled on my shoulders, then lifted as I made my final decision. Today wasn't about humiliating Alexander or exercising power. It was about reclaiming the integrity of my whole self, regardless of the consequences. I checked the time. 2 hours until the board meeting. My driver would be arriving shortly to take me to Westwood headquarters, where I would arrive through the private entrance reserved for board members, bypassing the main lobby, where Alexander would be confidently striding in, utterly unaware of what awaited him. The stage was set for a reckoning 15 years in the making, not with malice or vengeance, but with clarity and truth. The sleek company car glided through San Francisco's morning traffic, navigating the busy streets with practiced efficiency. Through the tinted windows, I watched the city transform from residential neighborhoods to the glass and steel landscape of the financial district. Westwood's headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a towering skyscraper, its logo, a stylized W, illuminated against the morning sky. "The private entrance, Ms. Chambers?" my driver asked as we approached. "Yes, James. Thank you." I gathered my briefcase, containing the documents I'd prepared the night before. He pulled into the discreet side entrance, accessible only to board members and select executives. The security guard recognized me immediately, nodding with respect. As I approached, "Good morning, Ms. Chambers. The board is assembling in conference room A." "Thank you, David. Has Mr. Phillips arrived?" "Yes, ma'am. He's waiting for you in your office." I took the dedicated elevator to the top floor, where my rarely used office overlooked the bay. The space was minimalist but elegant. No family. Photos, no personal touches, nothing that would connect Chairperson E.J. Chambers to Evelyn Reed. Even the name on the door displayed only my initials, part of the privacy measures implemented years ago. Warren rose from one of the visitor chairs as I entered, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You're really doing this," he said, not quite a question. I set my briefcase on the desk. "I am. May I ask what changed? You've been adamant about keeping your roles separate for 7 years." I considered his question, formulating an answer that would encompass the complexity of my decision without revealing the personal details of my marriage. "Integrity," I said finally. "The separation no longer serves any purpose except to perpetuate a false perception." Warren nodded slowly. "And Alexander? How do you think he'll react?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since leaving the Archer Hotel last night. How would Alexander respond to discovering his wife of 15 years was not just a board member, but the chairperson, Who controlled his professional fate? Would he be angry? Humiliated? Would he see it as betrayal? I don't know, I admitted, but his reaction isn't what matters today. The board is curious, Warren said, changing tactics. I've told them only that you'll be physically present for this meeting, which is unusual enough. They're speculating about the reason. Let them speculate. I'll explain when we're all assembled. Warren hesitated, then asked the question that truly concerned him. And Alexander's promotion? Has your decision on that changed? I moved to the window, gazing out at the fog still clinging to the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. This was the heart of my strategic decision. What to do about Alexander's promotion now that I'd decided to reveal my identity. The easy path would be revenge, using my position to block his advancement, a direct response to years of diminishment culminating in the trophy wife comment. It would be satisfying, perhaps even justified in the eyes of many. Alexander had certainly earned a reckoning, but revenge wasn't leadership, and despite everything, I was, above all else, a leader. The promotion will be considered on its merits, I said firmly, just as it would have been yesterday. Relief flickered across Warren's face. That's fair. I turned back to face him. I didn't build this company by making decisions based on personal feelings, Warren. I won't start today. He nodded, accepting this as the final word on the matter. The meeting begins in 20 minutes. Legal has prepared a brief statement addressing any governance concerns about your relationship to Alexander, confirming that all proper protocols have been followed regarding his advancement. Good. Have them distribute it after I've made my introduction. Warren moved toward the door, pausing before exiting. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. After he left, I took a moment to center myself, reviewing my approach one final time. The revelation of my identity would cause a stir, certainly, but Westwood was a publicly traded company with responsibilities to shareholders, employees, and customers. The board meeting had to proceed with appropriate decorum regardless of personal drama. I opened my laptop, reviewing Alexander's promotion packet one last time. His qualifications were undeniable. Revenue in his division had increased 43% under his leadership. Brand recognition had improved significantly, and his strategic marketing plan for the coming year was sound. His leadership evaluations, however, told a different story. High turnover in his department, consistently lower engagement scores, and feedback citing his tendency to take credit for his team's work while deflecting responsibility for failures. Exactly the same pattern I'd experienced. In our marriage, I realized with sudden clarity. The intercom on my desk buzzed. Ms. Chambers, the board members are arriving. Mr. Reed has also just entered the building through the main lobby. Thank you, Sharon. I'll be along shortly. I closed the promotion packet and took a deep breath. The moment of decision had arrived, not just about Alexander's professional future, but about the future of our relationship and my own integrity. The easy path would be to maintain the separation, to enter the boardroom as E.J. Chambers, conduct the meeting with professional distance, vote on Alexander's promotion based purely on his work performance, and continue the charade indefinitely. But that path no longer felt possible. The trophy wife comment had merely crystallized a truth I'd been avoiding for years. By compartmentalizing my identity, I had become complicit in my own diminishment. My decision wasn't about Alexander. It was about me. About honoring the wholeness of who I was rather than fragmenting myself for someone else's comfort. I gathered my materials and walked toward the boardroom, my steps measured and deliberate. Through the glass walls, I could see board members settling into their chairs, exchanging pleasantries, preparing for what they assumed would be a routine meeting. Outside the boardroom, I paused, watching the executive waiting area where Alexander sat reviewing notes on his tablet. He looked confident, polished, utterly unaware that his professional and personal worlds were about to collide. For a brief moment, I considered turning back, returning to my office, conducting the meeting via proxy as I usually did, preserving the comfortable fiction we'd both been living with. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. I'd made my decision not in anger or revenge, but with strategic clarity about who I was and who I wanted to be moving forward. I straightened my shoulders and pushed open the boardroom door. Heads turned as I entered, surprise registering on faces that had rarely seen their chairperson in person. Warren stood, gesturing to the empty chair at the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, Chairperson E.J. Chambers will be leading today's meeting in person. I took my seat, placing my materials precisely before me. Thank you, Warren. Before we begin, please invite Mr. Reed to join us. A board member frowned slightly. Isn't the executive review scheduled for 11? After the quarterly financials? We're adjusting the agenda, I replied calmly. I have a disclosure to make that affects today's proceedings. Warren moved to the door, signaling to his assistant. Moments later, Alexander entered, his expression shifting from confidence to slight confusion at finding himself summoned to the full board earlier than expected. Mr. Reed, Warren said formally, please have a seat. The chairperson has requested your presence. Alexander's gaze moved to me, sitting at the head of the table, a stranger to him in this context, yet the most familiar person in his life. And in that moment, everything changed. Confusion flickered across Alexander's face as he took the offered seat across from me. His eyes darted from me to Warren, then back again, trying to reconcile the unexpected presence of a woman he didn't recognize in the position of power he'd always described as occupied by some reclusive tech founder. I could practically see the gears turning behind his composed expression, scanning for context, for understanding, for solid ground in a suddenly shifting reality. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Reed, I said, my voice steady and professional. The voice of E.J. Chambers, chairperson of the board, not Evelyn Reed, supportive wife. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I have an important disclosure to make to the board. The other board members shifted in their seats, exchanging curious glances. This was unprecedented. I rarely attended meetings in person, and never without advance notice. As you all know, Westwood has maintained strict governance protocols regarding conflicts of interest and related party transactions. I paused, letting the formal language establish the proper tone. These protocols exist to ensure transparency and accountability at all levels of the organization. Alexander's brow furrowed slightly. This was not the routine promotion meeting he had expected. In accordance with these protocols, I must disclose a personal relationship that has potential governance implications for today's executive appointment decisions. I kept my gaze steady, facing the board rather than focusing solely on Alexander. I am married to Alexander Reed, candidate for Chief Marketing Officer. The boardroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Alexander, whose expression transformed from confusion to shock to disbelief in the span of seconds. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, words failing him entirely. Harriet Chen, our longest-serving board member, was the first to recover. I'm sorry, did you say you're married to Mr. Reed? Yes, I confirmed simply. We've been married for 15 years. But your name, another board member began. E.J. Chambers is my professional name, I explained. My legal name is Evelyn Jane Chambers Reed. Alexander's face had drained of color. His hands, normally so steady, gripped the edge of the conference table as though it might anchor him in a world that was rapidly shifting beneath him. This is, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. I don't understand. I turned to him, directly, meeting his gaze for the first time since he'd entered the room. I founded 3 companies under the name E.J. Chambers before we met, Alexander. I continued using it professionally after our marriage. But you? He shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear it. You're on the board? Of Westwood? I've been chairperson for 8 years, I stated simply. I recused myself from your hiring process and all subsequent promotion decisions concerning your department. The other board members watched our exchange with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. This was unprecedented territory for corporate governance, much less personal relationships. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" Alexander asked, his voice low but intense, the first edge of anger breaking through his shock. It was the question I'd anticipated, yet its simplicity still caught me slightly off guard. The complete answer was complex, layered with years of subtle shifts in our relationship dynamic. But this wasn't the time or place for marital excavation. "We can discuss the personal aspects of this situation privately," I said, drawing a firm boundary between our professional and personal lives. "For now, the board needs to understand that all proper governance protocols have been followed regarding your advancement at Westwood." I nodded to Warren, who distributed the legal brief, prepared earlier that morning. "This document confirms that I have recused myself from all decisions directly affecting Mr. Reed's employment since he joined the company 7 years ago. Those decisions have been handled by the executive committee without my input." Alexander stared at the document placed before him, but I could tell he wasn't reading it. His world had just been upended, and corporate governance procedures were hardly his primary concern. "I propose," I continued, addressing the board, "that we take a 30-minute recess to review this information and address any immediate questions. When we reconvene, we'll proceed with the agenda as planned, including the executive appointment decisions." Murmurs of agreement circulated around the table. I stood, signaling the official start of the recess. "We'll reconvene at 11. The board members filed out, some casting curious glances between Alexander and me, others studiously avoiding our eyes. Warren lingered briefly, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I gave him a slight nod, indicating I could handle what came next. When the room emptied, Alexander remained seated, still staring at the legal brief before him. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 15 years of unspoken truths. "My office is this way," I said finally, gathering my materials. He looked up, his expression hardening. "Your office? Here at Westwood? Where you're apparently the chairperson." "Yes," I replied calmly, refusing to be pulled into defensiveness. "Would you prefer to have this conversation in the hallway?" Alexander stood abruptly, his chair rolling back with the sudden movement. Without a word, he followed me out of the conference room and down the corridor to my office. The plaque beside the door displayed only E.J. Chambers, chairperson. No photo, nothing to connect the mysterious executive to the woman he thought he knew. Once inside, I closed the door and gestured to the sitting area rather than positioning myself behind the desk. This wasn't about asserting authority. It was about having an honest conversation after years of careful omission. 15 years, Alexander said as soon as I sat down, his voice tight with controlled anger. 15 years of marriage? And you never once mentioned you run the board of the company I work for? I don't run the company, I corrected gently. I chair the board that oversees it. That's your response? A technical distinction? He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting it for the first time I could remember. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How this will affect my credibility with the other executives? It was telling that his first concern was appearance rather than the breach of trust between us. But hadn't I expected exactly that? Your advancement has been based entirely on your own merit, I assured him. I've recused myself from all decisions regarding your career. That's not the point. His voice rose slightly before he caught himself, glancing toward the closed door. The point is, you've been living a double life, pretending to be just my wife while secretly being— He gestured around the office. This powerful executive I've talked about in the abstract for years. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, considering them carefully. Have I ever claimed to be just your wife, Alexander? Or is that the role you assigned me? He blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What are you talking about?" "Last night you introduced me to Warren as your trophy wife," I said, keeping my voice even. "Not as your partner, not as a successful entrepreneur in my own right, but as an ornamental possession." "It was a joke," he said dismissively. "People say things like that all the time." "Do they?" I held his gaze steadily. "Or do you?" Alexander paced to the window, staring out at the view I'd contemplated earlier that morning. "This isn't about some throwaway comment at a party. This is about you deliberately hiding a major part of your life from me for our entire marriage." "I didn't hide that I worked," I pointed out. "You knew I served on boards, advised companies, managed investments. But not that you were running the board of my company." He turned back, exasperation clear in his expression. "That's a pretty significant detail to omit." He was right, of course. It was a significant omission, one that had seemed necessary at the time but now felt impossible to justify. "Yes," I acknowledged. "It was." My simple agreement seemed to deflate some of his righteous indignation. He sank into the chair opposite me, studying my face as if seeing it for the first time. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Why keep it secret all these years?" It was the first genuine question he'd asked, the first that sought understanding rather than expressing outrage. It was also the first real test of the new boundaries I'd decided to establish, between honesty and cruelty, between accountability and accusation. "Initially, to protect your autonomy," I said truthfully. "I didn't want your career at Westwood to be overshadowed by my position." "And later?" he pressed, sensing there was more. I met his gaze directly. "Later because I realized you were more comfortable with Evelyn Reed, supportive wife, than you would be with E.J. Chambers, equal partner." The truth hung between us, challenging years of carefully maintained pretense. The first boundary had been drawn. Alexander stared at me, the impact of my words visible in his expression. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he was seeing me clearly, not as the supporting character in his success story, but as a woman with her own narrative, power, and achievements. "You think I wouldn't have been comfortable with your success?" he finally asked, his tone somewhere between defensive and genuinely questioning. "I think," I replied carefully, "that we both made choices that led us here. I chose to keep parts of my professional life separate. You chose to see only what fit your preferred narrative." The intercom on my desk buzzed before he could respond. "Ms. Chambers, the board will reconvene in 5 minutes," Sharon's voice announced. "Thank you," I responded, then turned back to Alexander. "We need to table this discussion for now. The board is waiting." He stood straightening his tie in a gesture I recognized as his pre-meeting ritual. "What happens now, with the promotion?" "The board will vote based on your qualifications and performance," I said, rising as well, "as they would for any candidate." "And you?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Will you vote?" "No, I'll continue to recuse myself from decisions directly affecting your employment." Some of the tension left his shoulders, though whether from relief or disappointment, I couldn't tell. We walked back to the boardroom in silence, each processing the seismic shift in our relationship. The board meeting proceeded with formal efficiency. Financial reports were reviewed, strategic initiatives discussed, and finally, executive appointments considered. True to my word, I recused myself when Alexander's promotion came up for vote. "The executive committee recommends Alexander Reed for the position of Chief Marketing Officer," Warren stated, presenting the formal nomination. "His performance metrics and strategic vision align with the company's growth objectives." The board deliberated briefly before approving the promotion unanimously. Alexander accepted with professional grace, showing none of the turmoil I knew he must be feeling. When the meeting adjourned, we exchanged a look that communicated what we both understood. Our conversation would continue later, away from corporate eyes. "Mr. Reed, I said formally as the room emptied. "Congratulations on your appointment." "Thank you, Chairperson Chambers," he replied with equal formality, the use of my professional name deliberate. "I appreciate the board's confidence." As he turned to leave, Warren approached with a reminder. "Don't forget the executive luncheon at 1. The press will be there for the announcement." Alexander nodded, then glanced back at me with an unspoken question. "I have other commitments," I said, answering what he hadn't asked. "Please send my regrets." Once alone, I gathered my materials and returned to my office, shutting the door firmly behind me. The morning's events had unfolded largely, as I'd anticipated, but the emotional weight was greater than I'd expected. Seeing the shock and confusion on Alexander's face had been difficult, despite the righteousness of my decision. I canceled my afternoon meetings with a brief email to my assistant and made a phone call I'd been considering for months. "Maya, it's Evelyn. I've been thinking about your proposal. If the offer is still open, I'd like to discuss moving forward." Maya Patel was the founder of a women-focused venture capital firm I'd advised informally for several years. She'd been trying to convince me to join as a formal partner, focusing on funding female entrepreneurs in tech, a far cry from my current role at the established traditional Westwood. "Evelyn, that's fantastic news." Maya's enthusiasm radiated through the phone. "What changed your mind?" I glanced at the framed Westwood mission statement on my wall, words I'd helped craft, but that suddenly felt hollow. "Let's just say I'm ready for a new challenge." "Well, your timing is perfect. We're closing our second fund next month and finalizing our investment thesis. Having you on board would be a game changer." We arranged to meet the following week to discuss details, and I felt a surge of energy I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't a reaction to the morning's events. It was a decision I'd been contemplating for months, held back only by the inertia of the comfortable patterns I'd established. After ending the call, I opened my laptop and began transferring files I'd need independently of Westwood's systems, my personal research, market analyses, and contact database. I wasn't making a hasty exit, but I was preparing for a transition that suddenly felt inevitable. My phone chimed with a text from Alexander. "Need to discuss tonight. Canceling Aquarello." I responded simply, "Home at 7. The message was followed by a call from Warren. "The press announcement went well," he reported. "Alexander was poised, articulate. No one would have guessed what happened this morning." "Good," I said, unsurprised. Alexander had always excelled at public performance. Warren paused before continuing. "The board has questions, of course, about the unusual arrangement." "I imagine they do," I acknowledged. "Schedule a special session for next week. I'll address their concerns directly." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, Westwood continues operating as it has for the past 8 years, effectively and profitably." After ending the call, I turned my attention to the stack of business plans Maya had sent months ago. Early-stage companies founded by women in fields ranging from biotech to sustainable energy to educational technology. I'd reviewed them briefly then, offering casual feedback, but now I studied them with focused interest. One in particular caught my attention: a platform using AI to match skilled women returning to the workforce after career breaks with companies seeking their expertise. The founder had left a promising career at Google to care for an ailing parent, then struggled to re-enter the industry despite her qualifications. Her solution addressed a problem I'd observed repeatedly in my years navigating the tech world. I made notes on potential improvements to the business model, market expansion opportunities, and strategic partnerships that could accelerate growth. The work absorbed me completely, engaging parts of my brain that had been underutilized in my governance role at Westwood. Hours passed unnoticed as I immersed myself in this alternative path, not running from my current reality, but moving purposefully towards something that aligned more authentically with my values and vision. When I finally looked up, the office had grown dark, the San Francisco skyline illuminated against the night sky. It was nearly 7. Time to go home and face the reckoning I knew awaited me there. I gathered the business plans into my briefcase alongside the Westwood materials I'd brought that morning, a physical representation of the parallel paths now before me. As I rode the private elevator down to the executive garage, I reflected on how different this felt from the vengeful exit fantasies people often indulge in after mistreatment. This wasn't about punishing Alexander or abandoning Westwood in a dramatic gesture. It was about investing my energy, expertise, and passion where they could create the most value, both for me and for others. The car waited in its usual spot, James standing patiently beside it. "Home, Ms. Chambers?" "Yes," I confirmed, settling into the back seat. "And James?" "From now on, please call me Evelyn." His eyes met mine briefly in the rearview mirror, registering the significance of this small but meaningful change. "Of course, Evelyn." As we pulled away from Westwood's headquarters, I didn't look back. My focus was already shifting forward, to the difficult conversation that awaited me at home, certainly, but also beyond it, to possibilities I'd kept at arm's length for too long. The weight I'd carried for years, maintaining separate identities, compartmentalizing my achievements, diminishing parts of myself to preserve Alexander's comfort, was already beginning to lift. In its place was something lighter but stronger, the freedom of integrity, of wholeness, of alternatives long considered but never pursued. The investment I was making now wasn't in Westwood, or even in Maya's venture fund. It was in myself, undivided, and undiminished for the first time in 15 years. The house was dark when I arrived, save for a single light in Alexander's home office. I found him there, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, a glass of scotch on the desk beside him. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Congratulations on the promotion," I said, setting my briefcase down and taking the chair across from him. "You earned it." He studied me for a long moment before responding. "Did I? Or was it granted by virtue of being married to the chairperson?" "You know that's not true," I replied calmly. "You saw the legal brief. I've recused myself from all decisions regarding your career at Westwood. And yet, here we are." He took a sip of his scotch. "My wife secretly controlling the board that oversees my entire professional life." I let the accusation hang in the air, noting the familiar pattern, his instinct to cast himself as the victim when confronted with uncomfortable truths. It was a dynamic I'd accepted for years, automatically shifting into the role of reassurer, soother, validator. Not tonight. "I don't control the board," I corrected evenly. "I chair it, and I've been transparent with them about our relationship from the beginning." "Just not with me," he countered. "No," I acknowledged, "not with you." Alexander pushed back from the desk, standing to pace the length of his office. The controlled anger of the morning had evolved into something more complex. Frustration, mingled with confusion, perhaps even a hint of soul-searching. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said finally. "Trying to understand how we got here. 15 years of marriage, and I never knew my wife chairs the board of the company where I work. How is that possible?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly over the years. In the beginning, it was about preventing conflicts of interest, I explained. When you decided to apply to Westwood, I'd just been appointed chairperson. I recused myself from your hiring process entirely. "That explains the first week, maybe the first month," he said. "Not 7 years." I nodded, acknowledging the point. "You're right. After that, it became, I searched for the right word. Easier to maintain the separation." Easier than what? Easier than watching you process what it would mean for your ego to work at a company where your wife held significant influence. Alexander stopped pacing, turning to face. "You think that little of me?" That I couldn't handle my wife being successful? I think, I said carefully, that you've always been comfortable with my success as long as it remained abstract and unthreatening to your sense of position. He scoffed. That's ridiculous. I've always supported your career. Have you? What? Exactly. Do you think my career is, Alexander? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He frowned, defensive. You serve on boards, advise companies, manage investments. And how do you describe that to your colleagues? To your friends? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the first glimmer of recognition. You tell them I keep busy with charity work, I continued. You introduce me as your trophy wife to the CEO of the company where I serve as chairperson. You reduce my renovation of our home, a project where I managed contractors, negotiated contracts, and calculated ROI, to me having an eye for curtains. Those were just casual comments, he protested, but with less conviction than before. They were revelations of how you see me, I countered, and they were consistent with a pattern that's existed throughout our marriage. Alexander returned to his chair, the defensive energy visibly draining from him. So, this is all my fault? You lied to me for years because I occasionally made thoughtless comments. No, I said firmly. I made choices too. I chose to maintain the separation between my roles. I chose not to correct your misperceptions. I chose comfort over confrontation. Why now? He asked after a long pause. Why reveal everything today, at this particular moment? I considered deflecting, offering some corporate governance rationale that would sound reasonable but miss the emotional truth. Instead, I opted for honesty. Trophy wife, I said simply. That was the moment I realized how complete the disconnect had become between who I am and how you see me. Alexander winced, the memory of his thoughtless comment clearly fresh in his mind. It was a stupid joke. Was it? Or was it an accurate reflection of how you've come to view me? He didn't answer immediately, and I didn't fill the silence. This was the pattern recognition I needed him to experience, seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the accumulated weight of casual dismissals and thoughtless diminishments. I've never thought of you as just a trophy wife, he said finally, his voice quieter. I know you're intelligent, capable. But not your equal, I supplied. Not someone whose professional achievements might rival or exceed your own. Another silence fell between us, heavier than the last. Outside, a car alarm briefly sounded before falling silent again. What happens now? Alexander asked eventually, his voice holding an uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him. With us, I mean. It was the question I'd been anticipating since leaving Westwood's offices. The immediate crisis had been navigated, the board informed, the promotion secured, the professional boundaries established. But the personal implications remained unresolved. That depends, I said, on whether you're capable of seeing me fully, not as an extension of yourself or an accessory to your success, but as a whole person with my own achievements, ambitions, and agency. And if I can, he pressed, then we have a foundation for rebuilding, I replied honestly. Not what we had before, but something more authentic. And if I can't? I met his gaze directly. Then we acknowledge that we've grown in different directions and we make decisions accordingly. Alexander studied me, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the wife he thought he knew. You've already decided, haven't you? You're just waiting to see if I catch up. The observation was surprisingly insightful, more aligned with the man I'd married 15 years ago than the one who had casually dismissed me at the Archer Hotel. I've decided to stop compromising my wholeness, I confirmed. Whether that's compatible with our marriage is something we'll both need to determine. He nodded slowly, processing this new reality. The dinner reservations can wait, I finished. This conversation is more important. I agree, he said, the simple acknowledgement feeling like the first genuine exchange we'd had in years. I stood, suddenly aware of the exhaustion settling into my bones after the emotional intensity of the day. I need some time to think. And I imagine you do too. Where are you going? He asked as I moved toward the door. The guest room, I replied. We both need space to process what's happened and what it means going forward. Alexander didn't protest, didn't attempt to persuade. Me otherwise, another departure from established patterns. Instead, he simply nodded. Okay. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. Evelyn? I paused in the doorway. I'm sorry, he said, the words sounding unfamiliar from his lips. For the trophy wife comment, and for not seeing you clearly. It wasn't a comprehensive acknowledgement of the patterns we'd both recognized today, but it was a start, a small crack in the facade of certainty and self-assurance he'd maintained for so long. Thank you, I said simply, not rushing to absolve him or minimize the hurt. Maintaining the boundary, I added, Good night, Alexander. In the guest room, I changed into comfortable clothes and sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. For the first time in years, I felt uncertain about the future of my marriage, yet strangely certain about myself. The patterns had been recognized, by both of us. What remained to be seen was whether recognition would lead to change, or merely to the acknowledgement that some distances cannot be bridged. Dawn broke over San Francisco, pale light filtering through the guest room blinds. I'd slept surprisingly well, the emotional exhaustion of the previous day giving way to dreamless rest. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the quiet house. No sounds of Alexander preparing for work, no coffee machine humming in the kitchen. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Warren and an email from Maya with the subject line, Partnership Terms, Draft. I set both aside, giving myself permission to begin the day on my own terms rather than immediately responding to others' needs, a small but significant shift. After a quick shower, I dressed in casual clothes rather than my usual business attire, another deliberate departure from routine. In the kitchen, I found a note from Alexander. Taking the day to think, will be at the club. A. The space felt different without him. Not empty, but open, full of possibility rather than expectation. I made a single cup of coffee and carried it to my home office, where I opened my laptop and began a task I'd been contemplating for months. Creating a personal development plan completely separate from my roles at Westwood or as Alexander's wife. At the top of a fresh document, I typed, E.J. Chambers, next chapter, then outlined 5 areas of focus. 1. Professional evolution. Transition from corporate governance to direct investment in women-led ventures. 2. Knowledge expansion. Advanced study in emerging technologies and sustainable business models. 3. Physical well-being. Regular exercise and outdoor activities currently neglected. 4. Creative pursuits. Return to photography. A passion abandoned. Years ago. 5. Relationship authenticity. Honest assessment of marriage and all personal connections. For each area, I set specific objectives, timeframes, and resources needed. This wasn't a reaction to yesterday's revelations, but rather a formalization of ideas that had been percolating beneath the surface of my consciousness for years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Under professional evolution, I drafted an email to Westwood's board proposing a 6-month transition plan for my role as chairperson. Not an immediate resignation, that would be irresponsible to the company I'd helped build, but a structured handover that would allow for seamless continuity while freeing me to pursue new ventures. For knowledge expansion, I registered for 2 courses I'd been eyeing at Stanford, one on AI ethics and another on circular economy business models. The fall semester would begin in 8 weeks, perfect timing if my transition from Westwood proceeded as planned. Physical well-being required the most immediate action. I'd allowed my fitness routine to lapse entirely over the past 2 years, prioritizing Westwood's international expansion over my own health. I researched hiking groups in the Bay Area and signed up for a Saturday morning trail expedition on Mount Tamalpais, an activity Alexander had always dismissed as unnecessarily strenuous when perfectly good gyms exist. The creative pursuits section prompted me to unearth my camera equipment from the storage closet. The Canon DSLR had gathered dust since our 3rd anniversary, when Alexander had commented that photography seemed like a hobby, not a serious pursuit. I checked the battery, found it dead, and ordered a replacement online along with a new lens I'd been coveting years ago. Finally, I reached relationship authenticity, the most complex area of all. Here, I didn't set specific actions, but rather questions to reflect upon. What parts of myself have I compromised or hidden in my marriage? What would a relationship based on mutual respect and recognition look like? Am I willing to rebuild with Alexander if he demonstrates genuine change? What boundaries are non-negotiable moving forward? As I finished typing the last question, my phone rang, Maya calling to follow up on her email. "Sorry to bug you so early," she began when I answered, "but I'm too excited to wait. Did you see the partnership proposal I sent?" "I saw it came in, but haven't reviewed it yet," I admitted. "Yesterday was eventful." "Eventful how?" Maya's curiosity was evident. I hesitated, then decided on transparency. I revealed my role as Westwood's chairperson to my husband, who happens to work there as the newly promoted chief marketing officer. Maya's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Wait, you never told your husband about Westwood? How did you manage that for? How long have you been chairperson?" 8 years, I replied. "And it's a long story involving separate professional identities and a mutual agreement not to discuss certain aspects of our work." "That's not mutual, that's compartmentalizing on an Olympic level," Maya observed. "What prompted the big reveal?" "He called me his trophy wife at his promotion celebration," I said, the words still carrying a sting despite my resolution not to take them personally. "He didn't." Maya's voice held appropriate outrage. "To your face?" "To the CEO's face. Actually, unaware that the CEO reports to me." Maya's laugh was somewhere between shock and appreciation. "Oh, the irony. How did he take the revelation?" "About as well as you'd expect," I said. "Shock, anger, confusion. We talked last night, and he's taking today to process everything." "And you? How are you processing it?" The question gave me pause. Most people in my life, including Alexander, rarely asked about my emotional state, assuming I was always steady, always in control. "I'm clarifying," I said finally, "separating who I've been from who I want to be." "Hence the interest in joining the fund." Maya connected the dots quickly. "Exactly. It's not a reaction to what happened, but the events certainly accelerated my timeline." "Well, the offer stands," Maya assured me. "Look over the terms, but no pressure on timing. We're building something for the long haul here." After ending the call, I returned to my self-development plan, adding specifics to each section until it formed a comprehensive roadmap for the next 6 months. The exercise wasn't merely aspirational, but practical, connecting immediate actions to longer-term vision in a way that made transformation tangible rather than theoretical. By mid-morning, I had calls scheduled with a hiking group leader, registration confirmation for my Stanford courses, a shipping notification for my camera, equipment, and a detailed first draft of my Westwood transition plan. The doorbell interrupted my flow. Opening the front door, I found a delivery person holding a large arrangement of calla lilies, my favorite flowers, though I couldn't remember ever explicitly telling Alexander this. The card read simply, "Thinking of you. Conversation when you're ready. A." I placed the flowers on the kitchen counter, noting the gesture without assigning it undue significance. In our early years together, Alexander had often used grand gestures to smooth over conflicts. Expensive jewelry after a fight, surprise weekend getaways when tensions rose. The flowers might indicate genuine reflection or merely a return to established patterns. Either way, my path forward remained clear. This wasn't about Alexander's response, but about my own commitment to personal integration and growth after years of compartmentalization. I returned to my office and opened Maya's email, reviewing the partnership terms with focused attention. The opportunity aligned perfectly with my expertise, values, and vision for the future. Investing in women entrepreneurs who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional venture capital, providing not just funding, but mentorship and strategic guidance. By noon, I had drafted a response accepting the general framework while proposing modifications to certain terms. My participation would begin gradually over the next 6 months, corresponding with my planned transition from Westwood. This wasn't an impulsive leap, but a deliberate step toward a future I'd been contemplating for longer than I'd acknowledged even to myself. The self-development initiative wasn't about escaping my current reality, but about creating alignment between who I was and how I lived, bringing congruence to parts of myself I'd kept separate for far too long. As I worked, I felt a clarity and purpose that had been missing in recent years. The revelation of my identity to Alexander had breached the walls between my compartmentalized selves, allowing energy to flow freely between them for the first time in memory. Whatever happened with our marriage, this integration was non-negotiable. Moving forward, I would no longer divide myself for anyone's comfort. Not Alexander's, not Westwood's, not even my own. 3 days after the board meeting revelation, I sat across from Caroline Chen at a quiet corner table in Cezanne. Caroline had been my closest friend during business school. Brilliant, direct, and fiercely loyal. She'd gone on to build a biotech company that revolutionized cancer diagnostics, eventually selling it for a figure that had made headlines in the industry press. Now she ran a foundation focused on medical innovation, occasionally making strategic investments that aligned with her vision. "You look different," Caroline said, studying me over the rim of her wine glass. "There's something, I don't know, lighter about you." I smiled, unsurprised by her perception. Caroline had always been attuned to subtle shifts in the people she cared about. "I feel different," I admitted. "Does this have something to do with why you suddenly wanted to meet for lunch after declining my last 6 invitations?" Her tone was teasing but held genuine curiosity. "Partly," I acknowledged. "Things have been evolving." Caroline set down her glass, giving me her full attention. "Evolving how?" I took a breath, then shared the events of the past few days. Alexander's trophy wife comment, my decision to reveal my role at Westwood, the subsequent conversations and realizations. Caroline listened without interruption, her expression shifting between surprise, vindication, and concern. "So Alexander had no idea you were his boss's boss for 7 years, she clarified when I finished. "That's correct. And he called. You his trophy wife to the CEO, who knew exactly who you were?" I nodded. Caroline let out a low whistle. "That's either the most exquisite corporate karma I've ever heard or the plot of a streaming series I'd definitely watch." Her expression grew more serious. "But honestly, Evelyn, how are you really feeling about all this?" The question was refreshingly direct, free from judgment or expectation. Unlike Warren, who was concerned primarily about corporate governance, or Maya, who viewed the situation through the lens of our potential partnership, Caroline was focused solely on my well-being. "Conflicted," I admitted. "Part of me feels liberated, like I've finally stopped contorting myself to fit inside a box that was always too small. But another part feels, I don't know, sad about the years of division, about the marriage I thought I had versus the one I actually had." Caroline nodded, understanding in her eyes. Have you talked to Alexander since that night? Brief exchanges, I said. He's giving me space, which is uncharacteristic but appreciated. He sent flowers, asked to talk when I'm ready. And are you? Ready? I considered the question carefully. Not yet. I'm focused on myself right now, on reintegrating parts of my life I've kept separate for too long. Good, Caroline said firmly. That's exactly where your focus should be. She leaned forward slightly. You know what struck me most listening? To your story? How completely you disappeared yourself for his comfort. I started to object, but Caroline held up a hand. Not disappeared entirely, she clarified. Obviously, you've been wildly successful professionally, but you compartmentalized your power, your achievements, your full self in your marriage. The Evelyn I knew at Stanford would never have tolerated being introduced as anyone's trophy anything. Her observation landed with unexpected force. Caroline was right. The woman I'd been during business school had been unapologetically ambitious, unwilling to diminish herself for anyone's comfort. When did that change? I asked quietly, more to myself than to her. Caroline's expression softened. Gradually, I imagine. That's how these things usually happen. Small compromises that don't seem significant in isolation until one day you realize how far you've drifted from yourself. That's exactly it, I nodded, feeling understood in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't one decision, but 1,000. Tiny ones. And now? Now I'm making different decisions, I said with growing conviction. I'm joining Maya Patel's venture fund as a partner, focusing on women-led startups. I've enrolled in courses at Stanford for the fall. I'm even taking up photography again. Caroline's face lit with genuine delight. Now that sounds like the Evelyn I remember. She raised her glass in a toast, to reclaiming yourself. I clinked my glass against hers, the simple gesture feeling surprisingly significant. To reclaiming myself. As we moved on to other topics, Caroline's foundation work, mutual acquaintances, industry developments, I felt a comfort and ease I'd nearly forgotten was possible. With Caroline, there was no need to modulate my intelligence, downplay my achievements, or pretend interest in topics that didn't engage me. The conversation flowed naturally between business strategy and personal reflections, intellectual challenges and shared memories. You know, Caroline said as we finished dessert, Alexander isn't the only one who's going to notice the change in you. Your whole social circle will need to adjust to Evelyn 2.0. I laughed at her characterization. I'm not sure it's that dramatic. It is, she insisted. Think about it. How many dinner parties have you attended where you deliberately played the supportive spouse rather than the powerhouse you actually are? How many of Alexander's colleagues have you smiled politely at while they mansplained industries you could buy and sell them in? They're all going to have cognitive dissonance when they encounter the real you. I hadn't considered this ripple effect. My focus had been so centered on Alexander's reaction and my professional transitions that I'd given little thought to our broader social connections. I suppose you're right, I acknowledged. Though many of those relationships were always more Alexander's than mine. Exactly, Caroline nodded. Which means you have an opportunity to build a social circle that reflects the authentic you, not just your role as Alexander's wife. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. Media wants to profile new CMO and family. Photographer suggested our home this weekend. Thoughts? The request was so perfectly aligned with our conversation that I almost laughed. Here was Alexander, still operating within the old paradigm, assuming I would naturally pose for photos as the supportive wife of Westwood's new CMO, despite everything that had transpired. Everything okay? Caroline asked, noting my expression. I showed her the text. Perfect timing. She read it and raised an eyebrow. And your response will be, I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to decline outright. Another part wonders if there's an opportunity here to begin establishing the new normal, whatever that might be. Caroline considered this. What would the new normal look like in this context? Honesty, I said after a moment's reflection. Not hiding who I am professionally, not playing a role for Alexander's benefit. But I'm not sure a corporate profile piece is the right forum for that. She nodded approvingly. That's the Evelyn Chen I wrote. Case studies with at Stanford. Thoughtful, strategic, unwilling to be pigeonholed. As we left the restaurant, Caroline impulsively pulled me into a hug. I've missed you, she said. The real you. I've missed me too, I replied, the simple truth resonating deeply. Walking back to my car, I felt a clarity and confidence that had been gradually building since the revelation at Westwood. Caroline's observations had crystallized something important: external validation of the changes I was making, confirmation that I wasn't overreacting or misinterpreting the patterns in my marriage. The Evelyn that Caroline remembered and recognized was the woman I wanted to be again. Integrated, authentic, undiminished. Her perspective had offered a mirror reflecting not just who I had become, but who I had once been and could be again. I composed a response to Alexander's text. Not available for home photo shoot. If Westwood wants to profile you as CMO, that's your decision. If they want to include me, it would need to acknowledge my professional role, not just our marriage. The boundary was clear, reasonable, and non-negotiable. Exactly the kind of response the Stanford Evelyn would have given without hesitation. As I drove home, I felt Caroline's words echoing, to reclaiming yourself. The external validation of her recognition had reinforced my internal compass, confirming that the path I was charting wasn't just reaction, but restoration. Finding my way back to the woman I'd always been beneath the compromises. Alexander was waiting in the living room when I returned home from lunch with Caroline. He sat with uncharacteristic stillness, his usual energy contained as he scrolled through his phone. At the sound of my entrance, he looked up, his expression carefully neutral. Your text, he began without preamble, about the profile. I set my purse down, maintaining the calm I'd cultivated over the past few days. Yes? I already told the communications team you'd participate. His tone carried a hint of frustration. They've built the entire piece around Westwood's newest executive family. You should have consulted me first, I pointed out, not unkindly but firmly. I didn't think I needed to, he admitted, and there was something refreshing about the directness of his response. It's the kind of thing you've always done. Exactly, I said, taking a seat across from him. It's the kind of thing I've always done, within the old parameters of our relationship. Those parameters have changed. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The communications director already sent over a photographer's availability. They want shots of us in our home, maybe walking along the Embarcadero, the typical executive lifestyle imagery. And how would they frame my role in this piece? I asked. He hesitated. As my wife, I assume. Not as chairperson of Westwood's board? Alexander winced slightly. That's complicated from a corporate communications standpoint. The official line is that your identity as chairperson remains private for security and governance reasons. Yet, you're asking me to pose as the CMO's supportive wife in a public relations piece for the very company I help lead, I observed. Do you see the contradiction? His shoulders tensed. It's not a contradiction. It's compartmentalization. The same approach you've maintained for years. An approach I'm no longer willing to perpetuate, I said calmly. If Westwood wants to profile you as their new CMO, that's appropriate. If they want to include me, it needs to reflect reality. What reality, exactly? There was an edge to his question. That my wife has secretly been my boss's boss for 7 years? That she never trusted me enough to tell me? That kind of reality would make for an interesting corporate profile. That's not fair, I responded, maintaining my composure. My decision to keep my role separate wasn't about trust. Then what was it about? He challenged. I considered my answer carefully. Initially, it was about avoiding conflicts of interest. Over time, it became about maintaining the peace in our marriage. What peace needed maintaining? His genuine confusion suggested he truly hadn't recognized the patterns I'd observed for years. The peace that existed as long as your achievements remained central and mine remained peripheral, I explained. The peace that depended on me playing a supporting role rather than an equal one. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. That's not how I see our marriage. It's how you've acted in our marriage, I countered gently. Perhaps without conscious intention, but consistently over time. He turned back to face me, frustration evident in his expression. So, now what? You won't participate in the profile? Do you know how that will look? I'm not refusing to participate, I clarified. I'm refusing to perpetuate a fiction. There are alternatives. You could be profiled individually, or we could both be featured authentically. Authentically, he repeated with a short laugh. The CMO and his chairperson wife, the corporate governance complications alone would dominate the entire piece. Then perhaps it's not the right time for a family profile, I suggested. Your promotion is still new. Focus on establishing yourself in the role before bringing our personal relationship into the corporate narrative. Alexander ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture I recognized as signaling intense frustration. I already committed to this. The communications team has been planning it since the announcement. Backing out now would raise questions. Questions are inevitable, I pointed out. Our situation is unusual. The only choice is whether we control the narrative or let it control us. He sank back onto the couch, the reality of our circumstances visibly settling over him. This is the first real consequence, isn't it? Of everything that happened at the board meeting. I nodded. The first of many adjustments we'll need to navigate. The board is already asking questions, he admitted after a moment, about whether my promotion was influenced by our relationship, despite all the legal documentation proving your recusal. That's understandable, I acknowledged. Perception matters in corporate leadership. It will take time for them to separate the professional facts from the personal implications. And in the meantime, he asked, a vulnerability in his question. I rarely heard from him. In the meantime, you demonstrate through performance why you deserved the promotion, I said. You focus on results, not optics. Alexander studied me, as if seeing aspects of my character that had previously escaped his notice. You've been navigating this kind of complexity for years, haven't you? The balance between personal and professional, the management of perceptions? Yes, I said simply. He shook his head slightly. And I never saw it. Never even thought to ask about the challenges you might be facing. It was the most self-aware observation he'd made since the revelation at Westwood. For a moment, I glimpsed the man I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago, perceptive, capable of growth, willing to question his own assumptions. What would you do? He asked after a long pause. About the profile? The question itself represented a shift. Alexander actively seeking my professional judgment rather than assuming his approach was correct. I considered carefully before responding. I would tell communications that given recent corporate governance clarifications, a family profile sends the wrong message at this time, I suggested. Position it as a matter of proper corporate protocol rather than personal preference. Request an individual professional profile focused exclusively on your vision for marketing at Westwood. He nodded slowly. That's actually very sensible. It allows you to establish your professional identity at Westwood separate from our personal connection, I continued. Which is what you've wanted all along, isn't it? To be recognized for your own merits? Yes, he admitted. Though the irony isn't lost on me that I'm now taking advice on this from my wife, who turns out to be the chairperson. A small smile touched my lips. Life is full of unexpected plot twists. Alexander reached for his phone. I'll call the communications director now. He paused before dialing. Thank you for the advice. You're welcome, I said simply. As he stepped into his office to make the call, I reflected on this first real consequence of our changed reality. It wouldn't be the last adjustment required, but it had revealed something important. Alexander was capable of adaptation, of reconsidering his assumptions when presented with compelling reasons to do so. Whether that capacity would extend to the deeper patterns in our marriage remained to be seen, but it offered a glimmer of possibility I hadn't fully anticipated. The first consequence had been navigated not through conflict, but through collaboration, a promising sign for whatever might come next. The special board meeting to address my relationship with Alexander was scheduled for Friday morning, 1 week after the initial revelation. I spent the days leading up to it finalizing my transition proposal and preparing my statement for the board, determined to approach the situation with transparency and professionalism. Alexander and I had established an uneasy truce in the interim. We shared meals occasionally, exchanged necessary information about household matters, and gave each other space to process the seismic shift in our relationship. The profile issue had been resolved according to my suggestion, with communications agreeing to focus solely on Alexander's professional role and vision for Westwood's marketing future. On Thursday evening, I was reviewing documents in my home office when Alexander knocked on the open door. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, lingering in the doorway. I closed my laptop. "Of course." He entered, taking the chair across from my desk rather than his usual perch on the edge. "I wanted to talk before tomorrow's board meeting." "What about specifically?" I asked, noting his unusually formal demeanor. "Warren told me you're presenting a transition plan," he said, "that you're planning to step down as chairperson." I hadn't shared this information with Alexander yet, wanting to finalize the details before discussing them. "I am," I confirmed. "A 6-month structured transition to ensure continuity for Westwood, while allowing me to pursue new opportunities. With Maya Patel's venture fund," he added, surprising me. "How did you know about that?" "Maya and I serve on the Technology Alliance Committee together," he explained. "She mentioned you were joining as a partner, focusing on women-led startups. I hadn't realized they knew each other, though it made sense given Alexander's professional network." "Yes, that's correct." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you tell me about this decision?" "I was planning to," I replied honestly, once the board had been formally notified. "But it affects me too," he pointed out. "My wife leaving the company where I've just been promoted to CMO raises questions about timing, about reasons." "I've been considering this move for months," I explained. "Long before your promotion or the events at the board meeting. The transition plan ensures there will be no negative implications for Westwood or its executive team." Alexander studied me, his expression difficult to read. "Is this about us? About what happened?" It was a fair question, though one without a simple answer. "It's about me," I said after a moment. "About aligning my professional path with my values and vision for the future." "And those values and vision no longer include Westwood? Or me?" The vulnerability in his question was unexpected. "Westwood has been an important chapter in my career," I said carefully. "But my passion has always been supporting innovation, particularly for entrepreneurs who face systemic barriers. Maya's fund offers an opportunity to do that work more directly." "You didn't answer the part about me," Alexander observed. I met his gaze directly. My decision to join Maya's fund isn't about you, Alexander. It's about my own professional fulfillment. As for us personally, that's a separate question, one we're still in the process of answering." He nodded slowly, seeming to accept this distinction. "What will you tell the board tomorrow?" "The truth," I said simply. "That I've accomplished what I set out to do at Westwood, guiding the company through its technological transformation and establishing a strong foundation for the future. That it's time for new leadership to take the company forward, and that I'll ensure a smooth transition over the next 6 months. And about us? I'll confirm that all proper governance protocols have been followed regarding your employment and advancement, as documented by legal. The personal aspects of our relationship are not relevant to the board's concerns." Alexander was quiet, for a moment absorbing this information. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. "What do you value most, Evelyn? In your work? In your life?" The unexpectedness of his inquiry required me to pause and consider my response. It wasn't the kind of question Alexander typically asked. He had always been more focused on concrete outcomes than underlying motivations. "Integrity," I said finally. "Alignment between who I am and how I live. Using my expertise and resources to create meaningful impact. Building connections based on mutual respect and recognition." "And have you found those things at Westwood?" he pressed. "Partially," I acknowledged. "The impact has been substantial, certainly. But the compartmentalization required has come at a cost to personal integrity." "Because of me," he concluded. "Not entirely," I corrected him. "I made my own choices, established my own boundaries. The situation was complex for both of us." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What would it have looked like if we had approached things differently from the beginning?" It was a hypothetical I'd contemplated often in recent days. "Perhaps I would have disclosed my role when you first considered joining Westwood, established proper recusal protocols then. Or you might have chosen a different company to avoid the governance complexities entirely." "And personally?" he asked, his voice quieter. "What would our relationship have looked like?" "More honest," I said simply. "Less compartmentalized. We might have been true partners rather than operating in parallel lanes that rarely intersected meaningfully." Something in my words seemed to resonate with him. He nodded slowly, absorbing this alternative vision of what could have been. "I've been thinking a lot about values, too," he admitted after a moment. "About what's driven my career, my choices. It's been illuminating." "In what way?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I've prioritized advancement, recognition, external validation," he said. "Measuring success by titles, by others' perceptions, by visible achievements." He paused. "I think I applied that same framework to our marriage. Viewing you as an extension of my success rather than an individual with your own ambitions and accomplishments." His insight surprised me with its clarity and self-awareness. "That's perceptive," I acknowledged. "Not perceptive enough or soon enough," he said with a wry smile. "It took my wife revealing herself as my company's chairperson to prompt this level of self-reflection." Despite the seriousness of our conversation, I found myself smiling slightly in return. Better late than never. Alexander's expression grew more serious again. "I don't want to lose you, Evelyn, not because of what you represent or how you enhance my image, but because of who you are, the woman I'm only now truly seeing clearly." His words touched something deep within me, a place where hope and skepticism resided side by side. "Seeing me as a start," I said carefully. "Understanding what that vision requires is the next step." "I want to try," he said simply. "To understand, to change, to rebuild based on truth rather than convenience or comfort." It was the most genuine expression of vulnerability I'd heard from him in years, perhaps ever. Not a grand gesture or performative apology, but a quiet acknowledgement of reality and a commitment to growth. "I appreciate that," I said, not making promises but leaving space for possibility. "We both have reflection to do, individually and, eventually, together." Alexander nodded, accepting this measured response. "Good luck tomorrow," he said, rising from his chair. "With the board." "Thank you," I replied. "For what it's worth, I believe you'll thrive as CMO, regardless of how our personal situation evolves." He paused at the door. "That's worth a lot, actually, coming from someone whose professional judgment I've come to respect enormously in recent days." After he left, I sat quietly, contemplating our conversation. For the first time since the revelation at Westwood, I sensed the possibility of authentic connection between us, not a return to what was, but perhaps an evolution towards something new, built on clearer values and honest recognition. The special board meeting proceeded with professional efficiency. I presented my 6-month transition plan, addressed governance questions regarding my relationship with Alexander, and confirmed that proper protocols had been followed throughout his employment at Westwood. The board members, initially concerned about potential conflicts of interest, were reassured by the comprehensive legal documentation and my transparent approach to the situation. "We regret your decision to step down," Harriet Chen said as the meeting concluded. "But we understand and respect your reasons. Your leadership has been instrumental in Westwood's transformation." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm confident the company is positioned for continued success under the board's guidance and the current executive team." Warren accompanied me back to my office after the meeting. "That went better than expected," he observed. "You've given them a clear path forward and addressed their concerns directly." "Transparency usually does," I noted, gathering my materials. "The transition committee will meet next week to begin the formal search for my replacement." Warren nodded, then hesitated before asking, "And personally, how are things progressing with Alexander?" "We're finding our way," I said simply, not elaborating on the nuances of our evolving relationship. "Thank you for your concern." After Warren left, I completed some necessary paperwork and prepared to depart. As I exited through the private elevator, my phone chimed with a message from Maya. "Board approved the partnership terms. We're official. Celebration dinner tonight?" A wave of excitement washed over me as I responded, "Absolutely. Name the time and place." Maya suggested 7 p.m. at Aquarello. Ironically, the same restaurant where Alexander had made reservations to celebrate his promotion the night of the board meeting revelation. The symmetry felt appropriate somehow, marking both an ending and a beginning. When I arrived home to change for dinner, I found Alexander in the kitchen preparing coffee, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater I hadn't seen him wear in years. "How did the board meeting go?" he asked, offering me a cup. "Smoothly," I replied, accepting it with a nod of thanks. "The transition plan was approved unanimously. The search committee will begin reviewing potential candidates next week." "Congratulations," he said, and I detected genuine sincerity in his tone. "Though Westwood will be diminished without your leadership. The foundation is strong," assured him, including the marketing division under its new CMO. A small smile touched his lips at my acknowledgement. "I received the official onboarding schedule today. Training sessions, departmental reviews, strategic planning meetings. It's substantial." "The role demands it," I observed. "You'll need a comprehensive understanding of all aspects of Westwood's operations to align marketing effectively." Alexander nodded, then seemed to notice my attire. I'd changed into a simple black dress appropriate for an evening out. "Are you going somewhere?" "Dinner with Maya," I explained. "The partnership agreement was approved today." "So it's official?" he asked. "You're joining her venture fund?" "Yes," I confirmed. though my active involvement will align with my transition from Westwood over the next 6 months. Alexander was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "I'm happy for you," he said finally. "It sounds like an opportunity better aligned with your values." His observation echoed my own thoughts so precisely that I looked at him with mild surprise. "It is, actually. Thank you for recognizing that." An awkward silence followed, both of us aware of the shifting ground beneath our relationship, but uncertain how to navigate it in this moment. "I've been thinking," Alexander said abruptly, "about what you said yesterday regarding compartmentalization and its cost to personal integrity." "Yes?" I encouraged, curious where his thoughts were leading. "I've done the same thing," he admitted. "Compartmentalizing different aspects of my life, presenting different versions of myself in different contexts. It seemed efficient, effective, even, but it's created distance from you, from myself." The insight struck me as remarkably self-aware, coming from a man who had, until recently, seemed oblivious to such psychological nuances. "I've enrolled in an executive coaching program," he continued. "Not the standard leadership training Westwood offers, but something more focused on authentic leadership and personal integration." "That's a significant step," I acknowledged, genuinely impressed by his initiative. Alexander shrugged slightly, a gesture that seemed designed to minimize the importance of his decision. "It seemed necessary, for my professional development and other reasons." The unspoken implication hung between us, that other reasons included our relationship, his desire to understand the patterns that had led us to this juncture. "I think it's an excellent decision," I said sincerely. "Self-awareness is fundamental to effective leadership." He nodded, appearing both relieved by my approval and somewhat uncomfortable with the vulnerability of sharing his decision. "Well, I won't keep you. Enjoy your dinner with Maya." As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, Alexander spoke again. "Evelyn?" I turned back. "Yes?" "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "for pursuing this new path with Maya's fund. It sounds like important work, the kind that will benefit from your expertise and vision." The words were so unexpected, so contrary to the dynamic that had defined our relationship for years, that I momentarily struggled to respond. "Thank you, Alexander. That means a great deal." His acknowledgement stayed with me as I drove to the restaurant, a small but significant indicator of potential change. Throughout our marriage, Alexander had rarely expressed genuine pride in my professional accomplishments, tending instead to acknowledge them briefly before redirecting conversation to his own pursuits. This simple, direct expression of admiration represented a noteworthy shift. Maya was waiting at the restaurant, her energy palpable as she rose to embrace me. "Partner," she said with a broad smile. "It has a nice ring to it." The dinner that followed was filled with vision and possibility, discussing potential investments, strategic approaches to supporting women entrepreneurs, plans for expanding the fund's impact beyond financial returns. Maya had ordered champagne to celebrate, and as we clinked glasses, I felt a surge of purpose and alignment that had been missing in my professional life for longer than I'd acknowledged. "To breaking glass ceilings and building new tables," Maya toasted. "To paths that align with purpose," I added. As the evening progressed, I found myself sharing more about the recent developments with Alexander than I had intended, drawn by Maya's insightful questions and genuine concern. "It sounds like he's actually reflecting," she observed. "That's more than many would do when confronted with their own blind spots." "He is," I acknowledged, "though whether reflection will translate to sustained change remains to be seen." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "People can surprise you. Sometimes it takes a shock to the system to catalyze genuine growth." "Perhaps," I allowed, unwilling to either dismiss the possibility or embrace it prematurely. "Whatever happens personally," Maya said, "professionally you're embarking on something that truly matters." The entrepreneurs will support, the innovations will help bring to market, the impact will be tangible and lasting. Her words resonated deeply, articulating exactly why this new path felt so right. It wasn't about escaping Westwood or my marriage, but about moving toward work that integrated my skills, values, and vision more completely than either had for years. As I drove home later that evening, I reflected on the parallel emergence of new possibilities, professionally with the venture fund partnership, and perhaps personally with a husband showing the first genuine signs of growth and recognition. Whether these paths would ultimately converge or diverge remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, both held authentic promise. 3 weeks after the board meeting revelation, the effects of my decision to step down as chairperson began rippling through Westwood's corporate ecosystem. The transition committee had identified potential candidates for my replacement. The announcement of my departure had been carefully communicated to key stakeholders, and a detailed knowledge transfer plan was underway. What I hadn't anticipated, however, was how the revelation of my dual identity would affect Alexander's position within the company. I noticed it first during a quarterly review meeting I attended as part of my transition responsibilities. Alexander was presenting the marketing division's strategic plan for the coming year, and while his presentation was flawless as always, the responses from his fellow executives had subtly shifted. "Impressive projections, Reed," commented the CFO with a glance in my direction. "Rather ambitious, though, don't you think?" "The numbers are based on thorough market analysis," Alexander replied confidently. "My team has validated them through multiple methodologies." "Of course," the CFO nodded, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "We'd expect nothing less from your division." The implication was subtle but unmistakable, a suggestion that Alexander's planning might receive special consideration due to our relationship. I watched Alexander's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, though his professional demeanor never faltered. After the meeting, Warren approached me in the hallway, keeping his voice low. "You've noticed it too, I imagine." "The shift in dynamics," I confirmed. "It's unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected." "Alexander is handling it well," Warren observed, "better than most would in his position." I nodded in agreement. "He's focused on the work rather than the politics. That's the right approach." Later that evening, I found Alexander in his home office, reviewing presentation materials with unusual intensity. He looked up briefly as I appeared in the doorway. "You saw what happened today," he said, not a question but an acknowledgement. "I did," I confirmed, entering the room and taking a seat across from him. "How are you processing it?" He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It's educational. Watching people reassess everything they thought they knew about me through this new lens." "People adapt to new information in different ways," I observed. "Some through humor, others through skepticism. Or through retroactively reinterpreting every interaction we've ever had," Alexander added with a wry smile. "Suddenly my marketing insights are suspect, my strategic recommendations questionable, my entire career trajectory open to re-examination." I studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders but also the surprising lack of anger in his voice. "It's temporary," I assured him. "Once my transition is complete, the focus will return to performance and results." "I know," he nodded. "It's just an interesting reversal of perspectives. For years, I've been the one whose professional identity was straightforward, unquestioned. Now I'm experiencing what it's like to have people see you through a filter not of your own making." The parallel to my experience as his wife, being seen primarily through the filter of our relationship rather than my own accomplishments, wasn't lost on either of us, though Alexander didn't articulate it directly. "The executive coaching is helping," he continued after a moment, "providing frameworks for navigating exactly this kind of complexity." "I'm glad to hear it," I said sincerely. Alexander set aside his materials, turning his full attention to me. There's something else happening at Westwood that you should know about. What's that? I asked, curious about his serious tone. The board is considering accelerating your transition timeline, he explained, not due to any concerns about your leadership, but to minimize the governance complications our relationship creates. This was news to me. I hadn't been informed of any discussions regarding changes to my carefully structured 6-month plan. Who told you this? Harriet Chen mentioned it after the executive committee meeting yesterday, Alexander said. She thought I already knew. I processed this information, considering its implications both professionally and personally. An accelerated transition would be challenging for Westwood, I noted. There are several critical initiatives that require continuity. That's what I told Harriet, Alexander said, surprising me again with his support. I emphasized that rushing your transition would potentially destabilize the very systems you've built so effectively. His advocacy on behalf of my transition plan, despite the professional complications our situation created for him, represented another unexpected shift in our relationship dynamic. Thank you, I said simply, for supporting the original timeline. Alexander shrugged slightly. It was the right position from a business standpoint. Westwood benefits from your continued leadership during this period. Still, I acknowledged, it couldn't have been easy given the undercurrents you're navigating. Perhaps not, he admitted. But one thing I've been reflecting on lately is how often I've made decisions based on what would benefit me rather than what was objectively right for all stakeholders involved. The self-awareness in his observation was striking. The Alexander I had known would have prioritized expediting my departure to clarify his own position and eliminate questions about his advancement. The system impact of our situation extends beyond Westwood, I noted. It's affecting our social connections as well. Alexander nodded in acknowledgement. I've noticed. 3 dinner invitations were rescinded in the past week. Apparently, our friends are unsure how to categorize us now that the power dynamic they assumed existed between us has been revealed as something quite different. People become uncomfortable when their mental models are disrupted, I observed, especially regarding relationships they thought they understood. Jordan Phillips was the most direct, Alexander continued, referring to a longtime friend and golf partner. He asked if I'd known all along and had been leveraging our relationship for career advancement. I winced slightly at the bluntness of the accusation. What did you tell him? The truth, Alexander said simply, that I was as surprised as anyone to discover my wife was Westwood's chairperson, and that if I'd known, I probably would have chosen a different company for my career path to avoid exactly the complications we're now experiencing. His candor was refreshing. No defensiveness, no redirection, just a straightforward acknowledgement of reality. Our situation is forcing everyone around us to recalibrate, I said, professionally and personally. Including us, Alexander added, quietly. The observation hung between us, an acknowledgement of the ongoing reassessment we were both undertaking of our relationship, our individual paths, and the possibility of a shared future that looked very different from our past. I've been invited to speak at a women's leadership conference next month, I mentioned, changing the subject slightly, about authentic leadership and overcoming institutional barriers. You should accept, Alexander said without hesitation. Your experience provides a valuable perspective others could benefit from. Again, his supportive response represented a departure from past patterns, where he might have questioned the time commitment or suggested the opportunity wasn't significant enough to warrant my participation. I already have, I confirmed. It aligns well with my work at Maya's fund. Alexander nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. The impact of your revelation isn't just affecting systems at Westwood or in our social circle. It's creating ripples that extend much further, opportunities for influence that weren't available when your identity as chairperson remained private. His observation was perceptive, identifying a positive consequence of our situation I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. The integration of my professional identities was indeed opening new avenues for impact beyond Westwood's corporate boundaries. Everything has consequences, I acknowledged. Some challenging, others unexpectedly positive. For both of us, Alexander agreed, his expression suggesting he too was discovering unforeseen benefits amidst the complications of our new reality. 2 months after the board meeting revelation, I was settling into a rhythm that balanced my transition responsibilities at Westwood with growing involvement in Maya's venture fund. My days were divided between knowledge transfer sessions with board members, meetings with potential fund investors, and evaluating promising startups founded by women entrepreneurs. Alexander and I had established a more open communication pattern, sharing details of our professional challenges and discussing the continuing adjustments to our new reality. While we still maintained separate bedrooms, a tentative warmth had begun to re-enter our interactions, born of mutual respect rather than habitual patterns. I returned home one evening after a particularly productive session with a biotech founder, whose innovative approach to drug delivery showed remarkable promise. The house was unusually quiet, no sounds of Alexander on conference calls or reviewing presentations in his office. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, preparing dinner with focused attention. "Welcome home," he said, looking up from the cutting board where he was dicing vegetables with unexpected skill. "How was your meeting? With the biotech startup?" "Promising," I replied, setting down my briefcase and taking in the scene before me. Candles arranged on the dining table, wine breathing in a decanter, classical music playing softly in the background. "What's all this?" "Dinner," Alexander said simply. "I thought we could use an evening to reconnect." The gesture was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Over the past weeks, Alexander had shown increasing interest in my work with Maya's fund, asking thoughtful questions about the entrepreneurs I was meeting and offering marketing insights when appropriate. This dinner, however, suggested a more personal intention. "It looks lovely," I acknowledged, moving to the refrigerator for water. "Can I help with anything?" "Just relax," he suggested. "Everything's under control." I took a seat at the kitchen island, watching as he moved with surprising confidence through the cooking process. "I didn't know you could cook like this." "Executive coaching recommendation," he explained with a slight smile. "Developing skills outside our comfort zones builds neural pathways that support flexibility in professional contexts." "And how are you finding it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Surprisingly satisfying," he admitted. "There's an immediate, tangible result, unlike much of what we do professionally, where impact can take months or years to materialize." The observation struck me as insightful, another example of the self-awareness Alexander had been developing in recent weeks. Dinner proved remarkably pleasant, the conversation flowing naturally between professional updates and more personal reflections. Alexander shared challenges he was facing with his marketing team, describing his efforts to implement a more collaborative leadership approach. "The executive who left before my promotion had created a competitive internal culture," he explained. "Team members were pitted against each other, fighting for recognition rather than working cooperatively." "How are you addressing it?" I asked. "Restructuring performance metrics to emphasize team outcomes over individual achievements," he said. "And modeling the behavior I want to see, acknowledging contributions openly, sharing credit appropriately." The approach he described represented a significant departure from his previous leadership style, which had often focused on personal achievement above team dynamics. As we finished dessert, a simple but elegant panna cotta, Alexander's expression grew more serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our future." The shift in tone caught my attention. "What specifically?" "I know things can't go back to how they were before," he continued. "Nor should they. But I believe we can build something better, something based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. It was the first time either of us had explicitly addressed the possibility of reconciliation rather than focusing on immediate adjustments to our new circumstances. "What would that look like to you?" I asked, curious about his vision. "Equal footing," he said without hesitation. "True recognition of each other's achievements and challenges, sharing not just the highlights but the struggles, the uncertainties. No more compartmentalization." The vision he articulated aligned remarkably with my own thoughts about what a healthy relationship might entail. Still, I remained cautious, aware that expressing intentions was easier than sustaining changed behavior. "Those are admirable goals," I acknowledged. "The question is whether they're sustainable beyond this period of heightened awareness." Alexander nodded, accepting the implicit challenge in my response. "That's fair. Words are easy. Consistent action is what matters." He reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but placing his own nearby, an invitation rather than a presumption. "I'm not asking for immediate reconciliation or promises, just openness to the possibility that what we're building now might be stronger than what we had before." The request was measured, respectful of boundaries while still expressing genuine desire for connection. I considered my response carefully, aware that this moment represented a significant juncture in our evolving relationship. "I'm open to the possibility," I said finally, "but I need to see sustained change, not just in how you relate to me, but in how you view partnership fundamentally." "That's all I'm asking for," he said, relief evident in his expression. "A chance to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that I understand what went wrong and am committed to doing better." The conversation shifted to more practical matters: his upcoming business trip to Chicago, my scheduled presentation to potential fund investors in New York, household decisions that required mutual input. Yet the underlying current had changed, acknowledgement of possibility adding a new dimension to our interactions. After dinner, as we cleared the table together, Alexander mentioned casually, "The Westwood Foundation annual gala is next month. As CMO, I'm expected to attend, but I completely understand if you'd prefer not to join me given the circumstances." The invitation represented another test of our evolving boundaries. In the past, I would have automatically attended such functions as Alexander's wife, regardless of my own preferences or commitments. "When exactly is it?" I asked, neither accepting nor declining immediately. "The 15th, he replied. "The same night as your women's leadership conference, actually." The fact that he was aware of this potential conflict, that he had tracked my professional commitment on his calendar, was itself noteworthy. "I appreciate the invitation," I said. "But the conference is a priority for me, particularly given my new role with the fund." "I completely understand," Alexander said without hesitation. "Your conference is more aligned with your current focus. The gala will be there next year." His ready acceptance of my decision, prioritizing my professional commitment over his desire for companionship at a corporate event, represented yet another indicator of potential change. As the evening concluded, I reflected on what had transpired. Not a dramatic reconciliation or grand gesture, but something perhaps more meaningful. A quiet, thoughtful attempt to demonstrate understanding of past patterns and commitment to creating new ones. The Women's Leadership Conference in New York proved to be a pivotal moment in my professional evolution. As I stood on stage before an audience of 500 ambitious women from various industries, I shared my journey of reclaiming my complete identity after years of compartmentalization. The most insidious barriers aren't always the ones imposed by institutions, I told them, but the ones we internalize and maintain ourselves, often in the name of peace, convenience, or others' comfort. My speech received a standing ovation, with dozens of women approaching me afterward to share their own experiences of diminishment in professional and personal contexts. The connections formed during those 2 days expanded my network significantly, introducing me to potential mentors for the entrepreneurs in Maya's portfolio and possible investors for the fund. Maya, who had attended to represent the venture fund, was elated with the response. "This is exactly the kind of authentic leadership our fund embodies," she said as we debriefed over breakfast on the final day. "You've positioned yourself perfectly as the public face of our investment thesis." Her observation gave me pause. The public face? That wasn't my intention. Maya smiled, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I know, which is what makes it so effective. Your authenticity resonates precisely because it isn't calculated. These women can see themselves in your journey." On the flight back to San Francisco, I reflected on Maya's comments and the unexpected direction my career was taking. After years of operating behind the scenes at Westwood, I was now stepping into a far more visible role, not just as an investor, but as an advocate for women's leadership and authentic professional identity. The shift felt right, aligned with both my skills and values in a way my chairperson role, for all its influence, had never quite achieved. I opened my laptop and began drafting a memo to Westwood's board, proposing an acceleration of my transition timeline. My original 6-month plan had been designed to ensure stability, but the company was adapting well to the changes, and my new direction was gaining momentum faster than anticipated. Alexander was waiting at the airport when I landed, a surprise, since I'd planned to take a car service home. As I approached, he stood from the bench where he'd been waiting, a genuine smile lighting his face. "Welcome back," he said, taking my carry-on. "How was the conference?" "Transformative," I replied honestly as we walked toward the parking garage, "and unexpected in many ways." "I watched the live stream of your speech," he said, surprising. Me again. "It was powerful, seeing you speak so openly about experiences I was partly responsible for creating." His acknowledgement was direct, without defensiveness or qualification. During the drive home, I shared highlights from the conference, describing the connections I'd formed and the potential partnerships for the fund. Alexander listened attentively, asking insightful questions about investment criteria and mentorship models. "You're truly in your element with this work," he observed as we pulled into our driveway. "There's an energy to how you describe it that I don't think I've ever seen before." "It feels right," I agreed. Like all the separate threads of my experience are finally weaving together into something cohesive. Inside, Alexander prepared tea while I unpacked, a domestic harmony that felt both familiar and new. When I joined him in the kitchen, I broached the subject that had occupied my thoughts on the flight. "I'm considering accelerating my transition from Westwood," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "The company is stable, the succession planning is well underway, and my work with the fund is gaining momentum." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, showing none of the surprise or resistance I might have expected. "That makes sense. Your passion is clearly with the venture fund now. You don't think it's premature?" I asked, curious about his perspective. "Not if the necessary structures are in place for a smooth handover," he replied. "And knowing you, I'm sure they are." His confidence in my judgment, expressed without reservation or self-reference, represented another subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. "I drafted a proposal on the flight," I acknowledged. 3 months instead of the remaining 4. "I'd be happy to review it if that would be helpful," Alexander offered. "Not as your husband, but as someone familiar with Westwood's operations who might spot potential gaps." The offer was thoughtful, recognizing both my autonomy in the decision and his relevant expertise. "I'd appreciate that," I said, reaching for my laptop to share the document. As we reviewed the transition plan together, I observed Alexander's approach with new eyes. He offered substantive feedback on specific elements, suggested refinements to the communication strategy, and identified areas where additional knowledge transfer might be needed. His input was valuable and delivered with professional respect, rather than personal agenda. "This is solid," he concluded after we'd spent an hour refining the document. The board would be foolish not to accept it. "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciative of his thoughtful engagement, for the feedback, and for understanding why this acceleration matters to me. Alexander closed my laptop, his expression turning more serious. "I've been thinking about my own path as well." "In what way?" I asked. "Westwood has been good for my career," he said carefully, "but I'm beginning to question whether it's where I can contribute most meaningfully long-term." His contemplation of alternatives surprised me. "You're considering leaving? After just receiving the promotion you worked years for?" "Not immediately," he clarified, "but eventually. The executive coaching has prompted me to reflect on purpose beyond advancement. What impact I actually want to have professionally." This was new territory indeed. Alexander questioning the career trajectory he'd pursued so single-mindedly for years. "Do you have specific alternatives in mind?" "I've been approached about joining the board of a marketing technology startup," he revealed. "The role would allow me to mentor younger executives while helping shape strategy for an innovative platform." "That sounds intriguing," I acknowledged, "and quite different from your current corporate path." "It is," he agreed. "It would mean a significant salary reduction initially, with compensation more tied to company performance through equity." The financial consideration would have been paramount in Alexander's decision-making before, that he mentioned it as a secondary factor rather than a primary concern indicated another shift in his values hierarchy. "What appeals to you about the opportunity?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "The chance to build something from earlier stages," he explained, enthusiasm evident in his voice. "To apply what I've learned about marketing strategy in a more entrepreneurial context. To work with a diverse founding team that brings fresh perspectives to challenges I've been addressing through traditional corporate approaches." His answer revealed thoughtful consideration beyond career advancement or status, focusing instead on learning, contribution, and alignment with emerging values. "It sounds like you're experiencing your own realignment," I observed. "Finding a path that integrates different aspects of your professional identity more authentically." Alexander nodded slowly. "I suppose I am, perhaps inspired by watching your journey these past months." The acknowledgement was gracious, free from the competitive edge that might once have colored such a statement. As we sat in the kitchen sharing tea and professional reflections, I recognized that we were both committing to new directions, not impulsively or in reaction to our changed relationship, but thoughtfully, building on genuine self-examination and evolving priorities. Westwood's board accepted my accelerated transition proposal with minimal deliberation. The 3-month timeline was approved unanimously, and Harriet Chen was appointed to lead the search committee for my replacement. The corporate announcement went out the following week, generating predictable waves of speculation in industry publications and business news outlets. TechWire's headline captured the general sentiment. "Chambers steps down. Westwood's reclusive chairperson accelerates." Departure. The article focused on my leadership during Westwood's technological transformation, noting that my decision to leave came shortly after governance disclosures regarding familial relationships within the company's leadership structure. Alexander handled the heightened scrutiny with remarkable poise. When questioned by colleagues or industry peers about my departure, he maintained a consistent message. E.J. Chambers has positioned Westwood for continued success through thoughtful succession planning. The company is fortunate to have benefited from her leadership. The professionalism of his response, referring to me by my professional name and title rather than as his wife, reflected his growing understanding of appropriate boundaries between our personal relationship and professional roles. 3 weeks after the announcement, Westwood held its annual strategic planning retreat at the Carneros Resort in Napa Valley. As chairperson, I was expected to attend the opening day to provide context for the company's long-term vision before the executive team delved into tactical planning for the coming year. Alexander and I drove to the resort separately. He had early meetings with his marketing team, while I planned to arrive just before the general session. The arrangement was practical, but also symbolic of our newly clarified professional boundaries. When I entered the resort's conference center, conversations quieted momentarily as executives and board members noted my arrival. I had grown accustomed to this reaction in recent months, the subtle recalibration that occurred when people who had known me primarily as Alexander's wife encountered me in my role as chairperson. Warren approached immediately, briefing me on the day's agenda and recent developments. "The board has narrowed the field to 3 candidates for your replacement," he informed me. "They'd like to discuss the finalists with you during the lunch break." "Of course," I agreed, reviewing the meeting materials he provided. The morning session progressed efficiently, with department heads presenting their yearly assessments and strategic recommendations. Alexander's marketing presentation was particularly impressive, data-driven, strategically sound, and delivered with confident authority. He addressed pointed questions from board members directly, without defensiveness or overcompensation. During a mid-morning break, I overheard a conversation between 2 board members that caught my attention. "Reed's really proven himself these past months," Joseph Adler commented. "I had concerns after the unusual circumstances came to light, but he's handled everything with remarkable professionalism." "Agreed," responded Michael Turner. "The marketing strategy he presented today shows genuine innovation. The governance complications are unfortunate, but his performance speaks for itself." Their assessment reflected a significant shift from the skepticism that had greeted Alexander immediately following the revelation of our relationship. Through consistent performance and professional conduct, he had begun rebuilding his credibility independently of his connection to me. At lunch, I met with the search committee to discuss the final candidates for my position. The conversation was productive and focused entirely on qualifications and fit for Westwood's future direction, with no references to Alexander or our personal situation. As the formal session concluded and attendees dispersed to afternoon breakout meetings, Alexander approached me in the lobby. "Your opening remarks were excellent," he said, "particularly the emphasis on innovation balanced with sustainable growth." "Thank you," I replied. "Your marketing presentation was equally impressive. The competitive analysis was particularly insightful." He nodded in acknowledgement of the professional compliment. "Are you heading back to the city now?" "I plan to," I confirmed. "The afternoon sessions don't require my input. There's a dinner this evening for the executive team and board," he mentioned. "Would you consider staying? As chairperson, your perspective would be valuable during the discussion." The invitation was professionally framed, without presumption or personal agenda. I considered it briefly before responding. "I'll check my schedule and let Warren know my decision." Alexander accepted this measured response without pressing further. "Of course, I have a breakout session starting now, but I'll see you this evening if you decide to stay." As he walked away, I noticed several executives observing our interaction with poorly disguised interest. The professional boundaries we maintained in the workplace fascinated those who had known us primarily as a married couple. I decided to remain for the dinner, recognizing that my presence would provide important continuity as the company navigated its upcoming leadership transition. After making arrangements for overnight accommodations, I spent the afternoon reviewing candidate profiles for my replacement. The executive dinner was held in a private dining room overlooking the resort's vineyards. I arrived deliberately after. Most attendees were seated, choosing a chair at the opposite end of the table from Alexander. Not out of avoidance, but to maintain appropriate professional distance during a business function. Throughout the meal, conversation flowed between strategic considerations and more casual industry discussions. I observed Alexander's interactions with his peers with new appreciation. He engaged thoughtfully, asked insightful questions, and demonstrated genuine interest in perspectives different from his own, a marked evolution from the more dominant conversational style he had often employed previously. When the topic turned to Westwood's innovation pipeline, Joseph Adler directed a question to me. Before you leave us, Chairperson Chambers, what do you see as our most significant opportunity in the next 5 years? All eyes turned to me, the collective attention a reminder of the authority I had wielded at Westwood for nearly a decade. Integrating artificial intelligence across product lines while maintaining our commitment to ethical implementation, I answered without hesitation. The companies that achieve this balance will define the next era of technology. Alexander nodded in agreement. Marketing has identified the same priority in our consumer research. Users want advanced capabilities but with transparent governance and clear ethical boundaries. The alignment of our professional perspectives, expressed independently and based on different analytical approaches, demonstrated a synchronicity that transcended our personal relationship. Several board members exchanged glances, perhaps noting this professional harmony despite our complex personal circumstances. As the evening progressed, I found myself engaged in conversation with Westwood's newly appointed Chief Technology Officer, discussing emerging trends in quantum computing. From across the table, I caught Alexander watching our interaction, a thoughtful expression on his face. Later, as attendees began dispersing to their rooms, Alexander approached me in the lobby. "It was valuable having you here this evening," he said. "Your insights about the innovation pipeline resonated with everyone." The discussion was productive, I agreed. Westwood is well positioned for the transition ahead. A brief silence fell between us, comfortable rather than awkward. "I'm heading out for a walk around the property," Alexander said finally. "Would you care to join me? The gardens are beautiful at night." The invitation was personal rather than professional, yet offered with a respect for boundaries that acknowledged my right to decline. I considered it briefly before nodding. "A walk sounds pleasant." As we strolled through the resort's illuminated gardens, our conversation shifted naturally from business matters to more philosophical reflections. The nature of leadership, the integration of personal values with professional ambitions, the challenge of authentic relationship in high-pressure careers. The morning after the executive dinner, Alexander and I found ourselves at breakfast together on the resort's terrace. The previous evening's walk had ended with companionable conversation rather than any dramatic reconciliation, both of us seemingly content to let our relationship evolve naturally, rather than forcing definitive conclusions. "The board approved the final candidate list for your replacement," Alexander mentioned as he stirred his coffee. "Interviews begin next week." "Warren informed me." I nodded. "The candidates are all exceptional. Westwood will be in capable hands." "And you?" he asked, his gaze direct. "Are you ready for the next chapter?" The question was deceptively simple, yet contained layers of meaning beyond my professional transition. I considered it carefully before responding. "I am," I said with quiet certainty. "Maya's fund has secured our initial investment target. We've already approved funding for 3 promising ventures. The work feels meaningful in ways I hadn't fully anticipated." Alexander nodded, absorbing this information. "I've been thinking more about the marketing technology startup I mentioned. The board position is compelling, but they've also raised the possibility of a more active role, Chief Strategy Officer, helping shape their go-to-market approach during a critical growth phase." The potential career shift he described represented a significant departure from the corporate path he had pursued so single-mindedly for years. "That sounds like an exciting opportunity. What's drawing you to it?" He considered the question with unusual thoughtfulness. "The chance to build something from earlier stages, to apply what I've learned in a more entrepreneurial context. And, honestly, the opportunity to redefine myself professionally, separate from Westwood and the circumstances of my promotion." His candor was striking, acknowledging directly how our situation had complicated his position at Westwood despite his qualifications for the role. Would you be comfortable with the financial adjustment? I asked, knowing how important compensation had always been to his sense of professional value. Surprisingly, yes, he replied. The executive coaching has prompted useful reflection on what actually matters to me at this stage of my career. Financial security remains important, but maximizing compensation isn't the priority it once was. A server approached with fresh coffee, briefly interrupting our conversation. When he departed, Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Evelyn, there's something I need to say, and this neutral setting seems appropriate. The shift in his tone caught my attention. I'm listening. He took a deliberate breath before continuing. I owe you an apology, not just for the trophy wife comment that catalyzed recent events, but for years of subtle diminishment I didn't even recognize I was inflicting. The directness of his acknowledgement was unexpected, as was the evident sincerity behind it. The executive coaching has helped me identify patterns in how I've approached relationships, particularly ours, he continued. I've consistently centered my experience, my achievements, my priorities, while relegating yours to secondary consideration. It wasn't conscious cruelty, but the impact was real regardless of my intention. I remained silent, allowing him space to articulate thoughts that clearly represented significant personal reflection. When you revealed yourself as Westwood's chairperson, my initial reaction was anger about your deception, he admitted. It's taken months of reflection to recognize the environment I created that made your compartmentalization feel necessary. If I had truly seen you as an equal partner, you might never have felt compelled to maintain that separation. His insight was remarkably accurate, naming the dynamic that had gradually shaped our relationship without deflecting responsibility or minimizing impact. The coaching helped you reach this understanding? I asked. It provided frameworks and guided reflection, he acknowledged. But experiencing the consequences directly has been the most powerful teacher. These past months, navigating Westwood with the power dynamic reversed, feeling others, reassess me through the lens of our relationship rather than my capabilities, has given me a glimpse of what you've experienced throughout our marriage. The parallel he drew was perceptive, demonstrating a depth of understanding I hadn't expected him to achieve. These realizations don't undo the past, he continued, nor do they automatically ensure I won't fall back into old patterns. But I wanted you to know that I see it now, the imbalance I created and perpetuated, often while believing I was being supportive. I took a moment to absorb his words, appreciating their comprehensiveness and lack of expectation. This wasn't a strategic apology designed to elicit forgiveness or reconciliation, but a genuine articulation of truth without agenda. Thank you for that acknowledgement, I said finally. It represents significant self-reflection. Alexander nodded, accepting my measured response without pushing for more. I don't expect this realization to change your decisions about your professional direction or our personal relationship. Those remain entirely yours to determine. I simply felt it important to articulate what I've come to understand, regardless of outcome. The absence of expectation in his statement was perhaps the most significant indicator of genuine change. The Alexander I had known would have viewed such vulnerability as a transaction, emotional honesty exchanged for specific desired outcomes. What I've realized through this process, I offered after a thoughtful pause, is that the compartmentalization wasn't solely your creation. I participated in it, allowed it, sometimes even enforced it, choosing comfort and conflict avoidance over the harder work of integration and authenticity. You were responding to the environment I helped create, he countered gently. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But I had agency throughout. I made choices that prioritized harmony over honesty, that maintained the separation between personal and professional rather than challenging it directly. Our mutual acknowledgement of responsibility, without deflection or blame, created a moment of unusual clarity between us. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, we were seeing each other and our relationship dynamics with genuine clarity, rather than through filters of expectation or assumption. "Where does this leave us?" Alexander asked finally, his question straightforward rather than laden with unstated expectations. "In a place of greater honesty than we've ever occupied before," I replied thoughtfully, "with potential for whatever comes next to be built on truth rather than convenience or compromise." He nodded, accepting this assessment. "That's a foundation worth building upon, whatever form that building ultimately takes." As we finished breakfast and prepared to depart, Alexander to his strategy sessions, I to meetings back in the city, there was a lightness between us that had nothing to do with resolution and everything to do with authenticity. No promises had been made, no definitive decisions reached about our future. Yet the simple articulation of truth had created space for possibility that manipulation or strategy never could have achieved. My final month as Westwood's chairperson unfolded with meticulous attention to proper governance and knowledge transfer. The board had selected Dr. Elaine Wright, former Chief Innovation Officer at a leading technology firm, as my successor. Her background in both technology development and corporate leadership made her ideally suited to guide Westwood through its next evolutionary phase. I developed a comprehensive transition plan, scheduling individual sessions with Elaine to discuss board dynamics, strategic initiatives, and institutional knowledge not captured in formal documentation. Our meetings proved productive and intellectually stimulating, her incisive questions demonstrating why the search committee had selected her unanimously. "Your governance infrastructure is exceptional," Elaine observed during one of our sessions in my office. "The balance between innovation and risk management is particularly well calibrated." "That's the result of years of refinement," I acknowledged, "and occasional course corrections when we've tilted too far in either direction." Elaine studied me with thoughtful consideration. "If you don't mind my asking, what prompted your decision to step down? Your leadership is clearly valued, and the company is thriving under your guidance." The question was professional, yet personal, asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. I considered my response carefully. "Westwood is positioned for continued success," I began. "The technological transformation we envisioned 8 years ago has largely been achieved. My skills and interests now align better with earlier stage ventures, particularly those led by underrepresented founders." Elaine nodded, accepting this explanation. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "And the personal circumstances? If I'm overstepping, please say so." She was referring, of course, to my relationship with Alexander, which had become common knowledge within Westwood's leadership circles despite our professional discretion. "Complex personal circumstances accelerated my timeline," I acknowledged, "but didn't determine my direction. The venture fund partnership represents a natural evolution of my professional journey." "That's helpful context," Elaine said. "I want to ensure appropriate boundaries are maintained regarding Mr. Reed's position while avoiding any appearance of overcorrection that might disadvantage him unfairly." Her awareness of the delicate balance required impressed me. "Alexander's performance should be evaluated on its merits," I advised. "The governance protocols established during my tenure provide a solid framework for managing potential conflicts while ensuring fair assessment." As my final board meeting approached, I devoted considerable attention to my closing remarks. This wasn't merely the conclusion of my tenure at Westwood, but represented the integration of my professional identities after years of careful separation. I would be addressing the board not just as Chairperson E.J. Chambers, but as the complete person I had finally allowed myself to become. The evening before the meeting, Alexander found me in my home office, working on final revisions to my statement. "May I interrupt?" he asked from the doorway. I looked up, setting aside my tablet. "Of course." He entered, taking the chair across from my desk. "I've been offered the Chief Strategy Officer position with Innovex," he said, referring to the marketing technology startup he had been considering. They want me to start in 6 weeks. Congratulations, I said sincerely. That's a significant opportunity. It is, he agreed, and the timing aligns well with your transition from Westwood. The synchronicity wasn't lost on either of us. Both, embarking on new professional journeys simultaneously, creating natural closure to the complicated dynamics our overlapping roles at Westwood had created. Have you accepted? I asked. I've indicated my interest, he replied, but wanted to discuss it with you first. The courtesy of consultation, without presumption or expectation, represented another subtle evolution in our relationship. Dynamic. What would this mean for us practically? I inquired. Innovex is based in San Francisco, correct? It is, he confirmed. No geographic complication. But the role will require significant travel initially as we establish market presence across key regions. I nodded, absorbing this information. My work with the fund will involve travel as well, particularly as we expand our investment thesis into international markets. Alexander studied me thoughtfully. 2 career-focused individuals with demanding travel schedules, that creates certain challenges for any relationship. It does, I acknowledged, though perhaps fewer than one career subordinated to another. A small smile touched his lips at my directness. An accurate assessment. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each contemplating the implications of these parallel professional transitions for our personal relationship. I'd like to accept the position, Alexander said finally. It represents the right next step professionally and creates cleaner boundaries personally as we continue determining our path forward. I agree, I said simply, and I support your decision. He nodded, accepting this straightforward endorsement without requiring effusive encouragement. Another subtle shift, his professional decisions no longer seeming to require my emotional labor to validate them. The following morning, I arrived at Westwood headquarters for my final board meeting as chairperson. The conference room held a different energy, a blend of retrospection and anticipation that often accompanies leadership transitions. Board members greeted me with a mixture of respect and curiosity about what my closing remarks might entail. Warren had arranged a small ceremony preceding the formal meeting, presenting me with an elegant crystal memento engraved with Westwood's logo and a simple acknowledgement. E. J. Chambers, Chairperson, Visionary Leadership, 2016 to 2024. On behalf of the board and the entire Westwood community, Warren said, thank you for guiding this company through its most significant transformation. Your leadership has created a foundation for continued innovation and success. I accepted the gift with genuine appreciation. Thank you, Warren, and to all the board members who have contributed their expertise and commitment throughout this journey. The formal meeting proceeded efficiently through necessary business matters before reaching the final agenda item, transition of chairperson authority. Elaine Wright was officially welcomed, governance documents were transferred, and I rose to deliver my closing remarks. 8 years ago, I began. I accepted the position of chairperson with a vision of transforming Westwood from a traditional hardware manufacturer into an integrated technology solutions provider. That transformation has been achieved through collective effort, strategic investment, and unwavering commitment to innovation. I paused, scanning the faces around the table, colleagues who had contributed to Westwood's evolution, who had known me primarily in my professional capacity, rather than through the filter of personal relationships. Leadership transitions represent not endings, but evolutions, I continued. Westwood is positioned for continued success under Dr. Wright's capable guidance, while I embark on new ventures aligned with my commitment to expanding access to innovation capital. My closing statement was precise, professional, and forward-looking, acknowledging accomplishments while emphasizing continuity and future potential rather than dwelling on departure. As the meeting concluded and I gathered my materials, board members approached individually to offer personal farewells. Their expressions of appreciation seemed more genuine than mere professional courtesy, many acknowledging specific contributions or moments of guidance that had proven valuable. I exited Westwood headquarters for the final time as chairperson with a sense of completion rather than loss. A chapter concluded with integrity, responsibilities transferred with care, relationships honored with respect. 3 months after my departure from Westwood, Maya's venture fund held its official launch event at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The evening was designed to showcase our investment philosophy and introduce the promising founders in our initial portfolio to potential limited partners and strategic allies. The museum's rooftop garden had been transformed for the occasion, sleek digital displays highlighting our portfolio companies, elegant refreshment stations, and a small stage for brief presentations. Maya had insisted on making the event more than a typical investment showcase, incorporating artistic elements that reflected our commitment to innovative thinking. "This is perfect," Maya said as we surveyed the space an hour before guests were scheduled to arrive. "Professional but distinctive, exactly the impression we want to create." I nodded in agreement, adjusting one of the displays featuring our investment criteria. The emphasis on founders rather than just concepts communicates our philosophy clearly. We had deliberately structured the event to highlight the entrepreneurs. We supported their journeys, visions, and potential impact, rather than focusing solely on financial projections or technological specifications. This human-centered approach differentiated our fund from more traditionally structured venture capital firms. "The media coverage is exceeding expectations," Maya noted, scrolling through her tablet. TechCrunch published that profile this morning, and Bloomberg has confirmed they're sending a reporter tonight. The fund's launch had generated significant industry interest, partly due to our focus on underrepresented founders, but also because of my transition from Westwood's chairperson to venture capital partner. The narrative of a corporate leader choosing to support early-stage entrepreneurs had resonated with both business and technology publications. As guests began arriving, I moved into my role as co-host, engaging with investors and industry leaders with the same poise I had maintained in Westwood's boardroom, but with a different energy, more openly passionate about the work, more personally invested in the outcomes. Midway through the evening, as I was discussing neural interface technology with the founder of our most scientifically ambitious portfolio company, I noticed Alexander entering the rooftop garden. His presence was unexpected but not unwelcome. I had mentioned the event during a recent conversation, but he hadn't indicated plans to attend. He moved through the space with practiced social grace, pausing to examine displays and engage briefly with other guests rather than approaching me immediately. This consideration for professional boundaries, allowing me to continue my conversation without interruption, reflected his growing awareness of situational appropriateness. When my discussion concluded, Alexander made his way toward me, stopping to accept a glass of champagne from a passing server. "Impressive event," he said as he reached me, gesturing toward the thoughtfully arranged space. "The integration of technology displays with artistic elements creates a distinctive atmosphere." "Thank you," I replied. "Maya deserves most of the credit for the concept. I merely refined the execution." Alexander smiled slightly at my deflection of praise, a habit he had gently called out during recent conversations about patterns in our communication. "I doubt that's entirely accurate, but I'll accept your framing for now." His good-humored acknowledgement of our ongoing work to recognize old patterns without dwelling on them created a moment of comfortable understanding between us. "How are preparations going for your transition to Innovex?" I asked. "Well structured," he replied. "I've been meeting with their executive team to align on strategic priorities before my official start date next week. The founder is remarkably open to input despite having built the company from concept." "That's promising," I observed. Leadership that values external perspective tends to build more resilient organizations. We were interrupted by Maya approaching with an older gentleman I recognized as Jerome Kapoor, a significant potential investor who had expressed particular interest in our healthcare-focused portfolio companies. Evelyn, Jerome has some questions about the neural interface technology that I think you're best positioned to address, Maya said. Oh, hello, she added, noticing Alexander. Maya, this is Alexander Reed, I introduced them, maintaining professional framing. Alexander, Maya Patel, my partner in the fund. We've met briefly at Technology Alliance events, Maya acknowledged. Nice to see you again. Likewise, Alexander replied with appropriate politeness. Don't let me interrupt. I know this evening is significant for the fund's launch. His understanding of the event's importance to my professional direction and willingness to remain peripheral rather than asserting connection demonstrated considerable growth from the man who had once casually introduced me as his trophy wife at a corporate function. Perhaps we could speak later, I suggested, balancing professional focus with personal courtesy. Alexander nodded. Of course, I'll be here for the duration. As I moved away with Maya and Jerome to discuss the neural interface technology, I noticed Westwood's new chairperson, Elaine Wright, entering the event. Her presence was less surprising than Alexander's. We had maintained professional contact since my departure, and she had expressed interest in exploring potential partnership opportunities between Westwood and emerging technologies in our portfolio. The evening progressed with presentations from selected founders, each articulating their vision and potential impact with compelling clarity. From my position near the stage, I occasionally caught glimpses of Alexander in the audience, his attention focused on the speakers rather than on me or other guests, genuinely engaged with the substance of the presentations rather than merely maintaining appearances. After the formal program concluded and guests returned to networking, Elaine approached me, champagne glass in hand. Impressive portfolio, she said, genuine respect evident in her tone. Particularly the neural interface company. Their approach to ethical implementation is refreshingly thorough. Thank you, I replied. We believe responsible innovation requires foresight regarding societal implications, not just technological capabilities. Elaine nodded in agreement. Westwood could benefit from closer connection to these emerging technologies. Perhaps we should discuss potential strategic investment opportunities. I'd welcome that conversation, I acknowledged, though we'd need to establish appropriate protocols given Alexander's position. Of course, Elaine said with professional understanding. Proper. Governance remains essential. Speaking of Alexander, she added, glancing across the room where he was engaged in conversation with one of our portfolio founders, he submitted his resignation yesterday, effective immediately rather than working through the standard notice. Period. This information surprised me, not the resignation itself, which aligned with his accepted position at Innovex, but the timing and immediate departure. Did he provide a reason for the accelerated timeline? He mentioned wanting to create cleaner boundaries for all parties, Elaine explained. His exact words were that Westwood deserves leadership fully committed to its future direction, without complicated histories affecting perception. 1 year after the fund's launch event, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel, addressing the attendees of the Women in Technology Leadership Summit. The audience of 500 accomplished professionals represented every sector of the industry, from startup founders to corporate executives, venture capitalists to academic innovators. The traditional metrics of success in technology have been defined by a narrow set of experiences and perspectives, I told them. Our fund's first-year results demonstrate that expanding those perspectives creates not just social value, but exceptional financial returns. The data supporting this assertion was projected on the screen behind me. Our portfolio companies had achieved an average growth rate of 87% since receiving investment, with 2 achieving significant market expansion. Through strategic partnerships we had helped facilitate. The neural interface company had recently closed a Series B round at a valuation 5 times higher than when we had made our initial investment. But beyond metrics, what truly matters is impact, I continued. The healthcare accessibility platform, developed by Dr. Yasmin Rahman, now serves communities in 12 states. The sustainable energy solution created by Elena Cortez has been implemented in 3 developing nations. These tangible outcomes represent technology fulfilling its highest purpose, addressing fundamental human needs through innovation. As DICD, I concluded my keynote and fielded questions from the audience. I noticed a familiar figure entering through a side door and taking a seat in the back row. Alexander had arrived just as my session was ending, timing that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid creating distraction during my presentation. Over the past year, our relationship had evolved into something neither of us would have predicted. After his departure from Westwood and successful integration into Innovex's leadership team, we had established a new pattern of connection. Not quite reconciliation in the traditional sense, but not separation either. We maintained separate residences, giving each other space to develop independently while keeping communication channels open and occasionally spending time together when our demanding schedules aligned. The arrangement defied conventional categories, which initially confused our social circle, but ultimately proved liberating for both of us. Without the pressure of fitting our relationship into predetermined structures, we had created something uniquely suited to our individual growth and mutual respect. After the formal Q&A concluded, I made my way through the crowd of well-wishers and colleagues, eventually reaching Alexander near the refreshment area. "Insightful presentation," he said, offering a glass of water. "Particularly your observations about how diverse leadership approaches create resilience during market volatility." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the water gratefully. "How much did you actually hear?" "Most of it," he admitted with a slight smile. "I arrived earlier than intended, but waited to enter until a natural transition point in your remarks." His consideration for my professional moment, ensuring his arrival didn't disrupt my presentation, reflected the fundamental shift in how he positioned himself in relation to my work. The Alexander who had once expected me to arrange my schedule around his career priorities now carefully calibrated his presence to support rather than overshadow my professional engagements. Innovex announced the strategic partnership with Global Solutions this morning, I noted, referring to a significant business development his company had been pursuing. "Congratulations! That represents substantial validation of your platform's enterprise capabilities." "Thank you," he acknowledged. "The integration process will be complex, but the expanded market access justifies the investment." Our conversation continued with genuine exchange of professional insights, neither competing for attention nor diminishing each other's accomplishments, but engaging as peers with valuable perspectives to share. The easy flow of discussion between us represented perhaps the most meaningful evolution in our relationship. Authentic recognition of each other's expertise without power dynamics distorting the interaction. Several of the summit speakers mentioned Maya's recent profile in Forbes, Alexander observed. "The fund is generating significant industry attention." "The timing is advantageous," I agreed. "We're preparing to close our second fund next month, focusing more specifically on healthcare innovation and climate technology. Areas with both substantial impact potential and market opportunity," he noted approvingly, aligning purpose with performance in the purest sense. His articulation of this balance between social impact and financial returns demonstrated how thoroughly he had absorbed concepts that once might have seemed secondary to pure profit metrics in his value system. As the event transitioned to a networking reception, familiar faces from various phases of my career approached to exchange greetings. Caroline Chen arrived with characteristic energy, embracing me warmly before acknowledging Alexander with polite professionalism. "The keynote was exceptional," Caroline said, especially the case studies demonstrating how your portfolio companies are redefining success metrics in their respective industries. Thank you, I replied. How are preparations for your foundation's healthcare initiative progressing? Remarkably well, Caroline answered. Actually, I was hoping to discuss potential synergies with your portfolio companies focused on healthcare accessibility. Perhaps we could schedule a proper meeting next week. I'd welcome that conversation. I agreed. Alexander, noting the professional nature of our discussion, excused himself with appropriate courtesy. I should connect with some colleagues who are attending. Evelyn, shall we meet as planned for dinner this evening? Yes, I confirmed. 7 o'clock. As he moved away to engage with other attendees, Caroline raised an eyebrow inquiringly. You two seem to have found an interesting equilibrium. We have, I acknowledged. Not what either of us would have predicted, but surprisingly functional. Relationships that evolve based on who you're becoming rather than who you were are rare, Caroline observed, especially after the kind of reckoning you experienced. Her insight captured precisely what made our current dynamic workable, its foundation in present reality and future potential rather than past patterns or traditional expectations. When the summit concluded later that afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past 18 months as my driver navigated through San Francisco traffic. From the moment of public revelation at Westwood's board meeting to my current role leading investments in transformative technologies, each step had contributed to an integrated professional identity that no longer required compartmentalization or compromise. The personal transformation had been equally significant, though less visible to external observers. I had moved from accommodation to authenticity, from segmentation to wholeness, from reflexive patterns to conscious choices about how I engaged with others, including Alexander. Whether our relationship would continue evolving toward deeper reconnection or eventually transition to a different form remained undetermined, a question we both seemed content to leave open rather than forcing premature definition. The freedom of this approach, the absence of arbitrary timelines or external expectations, created space for genuine discovery rather than performed reconciliation. 3 years to the day after Alexander had introduced me as his trophy wife, at the Archer Hotel, we found ourselves at the same venue for a different occasion altogether. The Technology Innovation Awards had selected the rooftop venue for their annual ceremony, recognizing transformative contributions to the industry, and both of us had reason to attend, I as a presenter for the Women in Technology Leadership Award, Alexander as a nominee for Strategic Innovation in Marketing Technology. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of us as we arrived separately but sat at adjacent tables, each surrounded by colleagues celebrating their respective achievements. The space looked much the same. Elegant chandeliers, sophisticated floral arrangements, champagne flowing freely among San Francisco's technology elite, yet everything else had fundamentally changed. Maya joined me at my table, resplendent in a vibrant blue gown that complemented her dynamic personality. 3 years ago, you were sitting at home contemplating your next move after being diminished in this very room, she observed quietly. Now you're presenting the most prestigious award of the evening. If that's not poetic justice, I don't know what is. Her observation was accurate, if incomplete. The journey from that evening to this one had been far more nuanced than simple reversal of fortune or vindication. It represented a comprehensive transformation in how I engaged with my professional identity, personal relationships, and fundamental sense of self. It's not about justice, I replied thoughtfully. It's about alignment, living and working from a place of integration rather than division. Maya nodded, understanding the philosophy I'd embodied these past years. Speaking of integration, how are things progressing with Alexander? I noticed you arrived separately, but seem quite comfortable in each other's orbit. We're navigating our own unique path, I explained. Neither conventional reconciliation nor typical separation, but something that honors both our individual journeys and shared history. Before Maya could respond, the ceremony began, drawing our attention to the stage where the association president welcomed attendees and introduced the evening's program. The first several awards proceeded efficiently, recognizing achievements in technological innovation, social impact, and environmental sustainability. When Alexander's category was announced, I found myself genuinely hoping for his success. The marketing platform he had helped develop at Innovex had truly transformed how emerging companies connected with appropriate audiences, making sophisticated outreach tools accessible to founders with limited resources. And the award for strategic innovation in marketing technology goes to Alexander Reed and the Innovex platform team. Applause filled the room as Alexander made his way to the stage, accepting the award with gracious professionalism. His acceptance speech focused primarily on recognizing his team's contributions, with particular emphasis on the diverse perspectives that had shaped the platform's inclusive design. True innovation emerges from integration of multiple viewpoints, he noted in his conclusion. Not from isolated brilliance, but from collaborative creation that values every contributor's unique insights. The philosophy he articulated represented significant evolution from the ambitious executive who had once prioritized personal achievement over collective contribution, a transformation paralleling my own journey toward integration and authenticity. Later in the evening, I took the stage to present the Women in Technology Leadership Award to Dr. Yasmin Rahman, whose healthcare accessibility platform had expanded to serve underrepresented communities across 27 states since receiving investment from our fund. Leadership isn't defined by title or authority, I noted in my introduction, but by the capacity to envision possibilities others haven't recognized and mobilize resources to realize those possibilities. Dr. Rahman exemplifies this definition through both technological innovation and commitment to equitable access. As the formal ceremony concluded and attendees moved into networking mode, Alexander approached my table, award in hand. "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "The recognition is well-deserved. Your platform has meaningfully expanded access to sophisticated marketing tools for emerging companies." "Thank you," he replied with genuine appreciation. "Your presentation for Dr. Rahman's award was exceptional, particularly your observations about leadership transcending traditional authority structures." We fell into comfortable conversation, joined occasionally by colleagues from our respective professional circles who had grown accustomed to our unique relationship dynamic. No longer a conventional married couple, but not simply professional acquaintances either. We had established a connection defined by mutual respect and authentic recognition, rather than prescribed roles or expectations. As the evening progressed, we found ourselves on the same rooftop terrace where, 3 years earlier, I had stood alone processing the implications of being publicly diminished by the man I had married. The city lights spread before us in a glittering tapestry, unchanged, yet viewed through entirely different perspectives. "Do you remember that night?" Alexander asked quietly. No need to specify which night he meant. "Vividly," I acknowledged. "Though it feels like observing someone else's experience now, a different version of myself responding to a different version of you." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "I've been reflecting on that evening recently. Not with regret. Exactly, but with awareness of how thoroughly my perspective has transformed since then." "In what way specifically?" I asked, genuinely interested in his reflection. "I introduced you as my trophy wife that night, not because I consciously intended to diminish you, but because I truly couldn't see beyond how your presence reflected on me," he explained thoughtfully. "My perception was so fundamentally self-centered that I was incapable of recognizing your inherent value separate from my experience of you." The insight demonstrated remarkable self-awareness, identifying not just the behavior, but the underlying mindset that had produced it. "And now?" I prompted. "Now I understand that every person exists independently of my perception of them," he said. That true connection requires recognition of that separate, complete existence, rather than merely how someone enhances or affects my experience. His articulation of this fundamental shift in perspective resonated deeply with my own philosophical resolution. The understanding that authentic relationship emerges from mutual recognition rather than projection or performance. That's the most profound transformation possible, I observed. Not just in behavior, but in foundational perception of self in relation to others. Alexander nodded in agreement. It's changed everything, not just how I relate to you, but how I engage with colleagues, friends, even strangers. Seeing people as complete in themselves rather than extensions of my experience or tools for my advancement. As we stood together overlooking the city, I recognized that our journey had come full circle. Not returning to where we began, but achieving a resolution that honored the complete arc of our shared experience. The man who had once casually diminished me in public, and the woman who had compartmentalized her power to preserve his comfort, had both evolved into more integrated, authentic individuals, capable of genuine recognition of each other and themselves. Whatever specific form our connection takes moving forward, I said after a comfortable silence, I'm grateful for the journey that brought us here, not despite its challenges, but because of them. As am I, Alexander replied simply. In that moment of mutual acknowledgement stood the philosophical resolution of our story, not a fairy tale reconciliation or dramatic separation, but the quiet recognition that transformation, however initiated, creates possibilities unavailable to those who remain unchanged by experience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.